Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a wedding so old, so tangled in medieval weirdness that you probably won't survive it. No, really. Between the rampant disease, legal loopholes, and the ever-looming threat of your marriage being annulled because your second cousin stood too close to the ceremony, you'd be lucky to make it to the wedding feast without something going horribly, historically wrong. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, what time is it where you are? Drop your city and the hour in the comments. I want to know who else is lying in bed listening to ancient marital drama. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes and blink into the soft glow of firelight. Your bed isn't quite a bed. It's a low wooden frame packed with straw and a scratchy wool blanket that smells like smoke and sheep. A rooster somewhere is screaming bloody murder, but you're not sure if it's morning or just the bird's natural flair for drama. You're 14, maybe 15. You don't have a mirror, but you can tell puberty's kind of halfway decided on you. Doesn't matter. You're getting married today. You didn't propose. You didn't even meet them until 3 weeks ago, when your father negotiated the match over a cold mug of ale and some hard cheese with another man you've now been taught to call father-in-law. You drag yourself out of bed and try to remember if this is a good thing. There's bread on the table and someone left a bit of salted pork for you. This is generous. You're a merchant's kid. Not poor, not noble. You know enough to write your name and count to 20, but Latin makes your head hurt. That's okay. No one's marrying you for your brains. It's your connection to that cloth route going through Flanders. Your soon-to-be spouse. Their family controls a few warehouses in the next market town over. Boom. Match made in logistical heaven. A few streets away, your bride or groom is getting ready too. They're probably just as thrilled as you. Okay, maybe slightly more excited if they're a romantic. You aren't. You're practical. It's the Middle Ages after all. The average life expectancy is somewhere between too young to vote and never got to own your own ox. So a wedding means security. It means an alliance. It might even mean your family won't starve if next winter goes full apocalypse. Downstairs, your mother is brushing your hair with something that looks like it once belonged to a horse. She's explaining the ceremony, but you're only half listening. You already know the basics. You stand up in front of your village, or just a couple witnesses, say some words that sound legally binding, and boom, you're shackled for life, or until someone dies from a poorly sterilized splinter. You step outside into a morning that smells like damp hay and animal poop. There's a lot of grey in the sky, but no rain yet. Good omen? Maybe. A neighbour nods solemnly as you pass, like you're headed off to war, which, in a way, you are. A war of emotional endurance, limited personal freedom, and potential in-laws who believe you're the devil because you once ate garlic on a Sunday. Here's the thing people forget. Medieval marriage isn't a personal love story. It's a public performance with private consequences. Sure, the troubadours sing about love, but most people live out their days in practical, often loveless arrangements. If love happens, great. If not, well, you still get joint land rights and maybe a cow. As you walk, a random dog joins your procession. This is very on brand. Weddings and animals go hand in hand, cats in churches, goats in courtyards, and pigs crashing feasts. You make a mental note to kick the dog out of your bedroom if it tries to witness anything later. You arrive at a courtyard where some wooden benches have been dragged out. No church for this one. The local priest is sick or drunk, or both. It's fine. Technically, you don't even need him. All you need are vows, witnesses, and the public's ability to hear you clearly promise you're not already married to someone else. You turn to your future spouse. They look nervous. You do too. You both say the words, "I take thee," and all that jazz, and just like that, it's done. Well, sort of. See, in this weird timeline of the medieval world, the wedding is kind of the halfway point. There's the engagement, the public vows, and later, the all-important consummation, which absolutely must be witnessed, rumoured, or at least heavily implied to satisfy both law and society. Until then, people might consider the marriage incomplete, and that's dangerous, because if someone down the line wants to contest it, say for land inheritance or social status, they can. You're pulled into a quick embrace by your mother. Someone throws a handful of herbs at your face, parsley maybe, and someone else starts playing what can only be described as the medieval version of bagpipes. It's a vibe, a strange, nasal vibe. Historically speaking, this exact kind of ceremony, the semi-formal, backyard-style affair, wasn't uncommon. especially before the 13th century, when the church got really serious about regulating marriages. Back then, couples could marry with just mutual consent. No priest, no license, not even a ring. Just two people saying yes in front of a few others. Boom, married. And while it sounds romantic, it led to chaos. People kept secretly marrying and then denying it later. It took until 1215 for the church to start enforcing bans and public ceremonies, and even then people found loopholes. Quirky fact of the night. In some places, especially among peasants, marriage was announced by dancing in front of the whole village. Like literal dancing in the dirt, no DJ, just your awkward cousin playing the lute badly. And here's something still debated. Were medieval people really as cold and transactional about love as we think? Some scholars argue there were real feelings involved, and that emotional closeness grew naturally from shared hardship. Others point out the social pressures were too intense, and affection was more performance than passion. As the makeshift ceremony wraps up, you're whisked toward the feast. You glance back once at the spot where you mumbled your vows. It wasn't grand, it wasn't polished, but it was yours. And for better or worse, it just changed your life. The feast isn't quite the banquet you might expect. There's no tiered cake, no open bar, and certainly no DJ announcing the bride and groom like local celebrities. Instead, it's more of a community potluck with an overlay of formal awkwardness. The neighbours bring bread. Someone contributes a jug of cider that tastes like it might also remove paint. Your aunt shows up with a pigeon pie, and while you'd rather not think too hard about it, it smells shockingly good. Everyone gathers under a stretched linen canopy rigged between fence posts. The table is just some wooden planks on barrels, and the plates are more like wooden slabs that never met a sponge in their life. You and your new spouse sit at the centre of it all, a little stunned, a little sweaty. The whole thing feels vaguely like being the star of a play you didn't audition for. People keep raising cups in your honour, toasting your union with enthusiasm that grows louder and less coherent as the drinks flow. An old man from 2 cottages down tries to give you marriage advice between gulps of ale, slurring through a tale about how he once courted a woman by giving her a goose. No one really knows what to say to that. But let's back up a little. Before this table was set, before the bread was baked and the goat was roasted, the real work of this wedding had already been done, long before the ceremony. Engagement in the medieval world was a whole different beast. Today, people propose with rings, maybe on a beach, maybe with a drone flying overhead if they're particularly bold. But back then, engagements were formal contracts negotiated between families, often sealed before either party was old enough to have lost all their baby teeth. You were probably spoken for by the time you were 7, maybe 10 if your parents were dragging their feet. These early betrothals were less about romantic compatibility, and more about property, alliances, and power. Think of it like a chessboard. Marriages arranged not for love, but for strategic positioning. If your father was a tanner and the family 3 villages over owned a few acres of prime sheep pasture, suddenly your value skyrocketed. Even among peasants, the betrothal process was serious business. Witnesses were called in, small tokens were exchanged, gifts, sometimes rings or knives symbolizing intent. Occasionally the promise was solemnized in a church, even though the church hadn't fully taken control of marriage laws yet. And breaking off a betrothal? That wasn't easy. You could end up paying fines, losing face in your community, or being forced into a union you hated just to keep the peace. Sometimes the couple didn't even know about their betrothal until it was already official. Imagine waking up one morning to find out you're promised to someone 2 towns over because your dad needed access to a grain mill. Not ideal, but this was life. Even royalty didn't escape it. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example. She was married off at age 15 to Louis VII of France. The match was entirely political, and though Eleanor had a mind of her own, to put it mildly, even she had to play the marriage game like everyone else. Still, here's the quirky bit. Despite all the formality, these betrothals were sometimes treated with the emotional weight of full marriages. Some were consummated almost immediately, even if the children were barely into adolescence. This led to a whole wave of problems like infertility, childbirth complications, and psychological trauma, but no one at the time really batted an eye, except the occasional monk writing disapprovingly from his cell. Of course, engagement didn't always mean immediate marriage. Often, families waited until both kids hit puberty, by whatever strange medieval metric they used to gauge such things. For boys, it was usually when their voice dropped and they could hold a plough. For girls, it was menarche, the first period, which was treated like a literal alarm bell for marital readiness. Once biology gave its reluctant green light, the families reconvened. Dates were chosen, dowries were discussed, and soon enough, a wedding day was set. You look across the table at your new partner. They're talking to your cousin, laughing at something you didn't hear. You can't decide whether that makes you feel relieved or strangely territorial. Maybe both. It's odd to think that just weeks ago you were strangers, or at least barely acquaintances, and now you share a name, a bed, and a set of legal obligations that could outlive both of you. Speaking of legal obligations, there's a hot historical debate you should know about. Scholars still argue over how binding these engagements were. Were they legally equivalent to marriage? Could you back out without social ruin? Some argue that breaking a betrothal was akin to divorce, a moral and sometimes spiritual failing. Others claim people bailed all the time, especially if someone richer came along. It's murky, as most medieval records are. But one thing is clear. Being engaged wasn't a private affair. It was a public declaration, and the public never forgot. Back at your feast, someone starts a song. It's off-key and slightly rude, full of double meanings and veiled jokes about what's going to happen later tonight. A few people laugh nervously. You stare at your trencher and wonder if you're supposed to laugh too. Suddenly the goat from earlier is paraded around, now cooked, with apples in its mouth and herbs sticking out of unmentionable places. The smell is incredible. Your stomach growls. Food in a medieval wedding isn't just sustenance, it's a performance. The bigger the feast, the wealthier and more powerful your family appears. Nobles sometimes held banquets that lasted days, with roast swans, sugared fruits, and entertainment ranging from jugglers to sword fights. You've got a roasted goat, some turnips, and a distant relative trying to play a harp he clearly doesn't know how to tune. Still, it's something. It's celebration. It's proof that you've made it to the next stage of a life, ready or not. You take a bite of something vaguely mushy but delicious. Someone passes you a wooden cup of wine so sour it makes your eyes water. You smile politely anyway. Because now, whether you feel like it or not, you're a spouse. Legally bound, socially approved, maybe even blessed by God if you said the right words loud enough. All you can do is ride this out. You hope your new partner doesn't snore, or have fleas, or both. The sun starts to dip behind the thatched rooftops. The air cools, the music softens. You catch a glimpse of yourself reflected in a bowl of water and try to imagine what married life will be like. You don't have a clue, but you'll find out soon enough. The feast may have quieted down, but your nerves haven't. The sun is now a bleeding orange disk slipping behind the crooked rooftops, casting long, flickering shadows over the uneven tables and the smirking faces of relatives who've had just enough cider to get bold. Children run barefoot between the benches, throwing crumbs at chickens that absolutely were not invited. A lute has lost 2 strings. Someone's uncle is singing a verse about ploughing the maiden field, and even the priest, who finally showed up halfway through the meal, smelling suspiciously of honey wine, isn't bothering to pretend he's shocked. You shift in your seat, aware of what's coming next. Not the bedding ceremony yet, but another important moment in the labyrinthine structure of medieval matrimony, the negotiation over what you brought into this arrangement, what you're worth, basically, not as a person, as an asset. You feel it before you hear it, your father, clearing his throat, rising, cup in hand. His speech is part formality, part defense attorney. He's announcing what you're bringing into this marriage, your dowry, or if you're the groom, what's being paid to your family and bride price. This isn't a minor detail. In some cases, it's the entire point of the union. Your dowry might be modest, a bolt of wool cloth, some kitchen pots, and 2 hens. But even these are recorded, witnessed, and mentally catalogued by both families. Everyone knows someone whose marriage fell apart because someone forgot to deliver that second goat promised in the betrothal phase. Dowries are a kind of insurance, after all. If your spouse dies, or ditches you, you might have to fall back on that wool or those chickens to survive. Among nobles, though, dowries could be massive. Land grants, castles, whole forests. Your marriage could change borders, start wars, or bankrupt an ambitious uncle. Take, for example, Margaret of Denmark, who married James III of Scotland in the 15th century. Her dowry included the Orkney and Shetland Islands, real estate deals disguised as romance. On the other side, if you're the groom, your family may have paid a bride price to hers, This isn't buying a wife, exactly. It's compensation for the loss of a working hand in the household, or an investment into future grandchildren who will carry both names. It's a balance, in theory. In practice, it gets messy. Sometimes the bride price never arrives. Sometimes the dowry is deliberately exaggerated. Sometimes the goods listed were pledged as on their way, only for the sender to disappear mysteriously into the woods. You sip your drink and try to look pleasant. You know this moment matters. If you're lucky, it's just ceremony. If you're not, someone will contest these terms in 6 months, and you'll be dragged into a town court where a half-blind scribe reads out loud about your missing cow in front of 30 grumpy villagers. These financial arrangements were so crucial that in some towns, they were carved into stone, literally. There are records of dowry agreements etched onto stone slabs or copied into church ledgers, complete with witness names and personal marks. It wasn't just paperwork. It was a binding pact between families, sealed by bloodlines and livestock. The quirky fact here: in some rural communities, instead of a formal dowry, the groom would offer symbolic gifts, a pair of shoes, a knife, even a decorated belt. These items, though modest, held real meaning. They were tangible signs that the groom could provide something, anything, and that the bride was being transferred respectfully. There's even evidence of grooms giving a live eel. You try not to picture yourself receiving one tonight. There's a lot to unpack when it comes to what marriage meant in legal terms, and here's where the debate comes in. Historians are still arguing about just how much power women had in these exchanges. Were they pawns, shuffled around like sacks of grain? Or did they wield more quiet influence than we think? Some sources suggest women, especially widows, could negotiate their own dowries or use clever contracts to retain property rights even after marriage. Others argue the system was so patriarchal, so deeply stacked against them, that even a clever clause couldn't save a woman from being reduced to inventory. And then there's the church, watching all. This with the kind of judgmental glare only medieval clergymen could perfect. By the late 12th century, church authorities began pushing harder to enforce consent in marriage, mutual agreement by both bride and groom. Sounds great, right? Except in practice, this often clashed with traditional family arrangements. What if two people consented secretly, but their parents hadn't agreed? Was it valid? What if they didn't consummate? Could it still count? You think about this as the last round of stew is ladled out. Maybe your new spouse is silently calculating your family's assets, or maybe they're just hoping there's dessert. Either way, the legal side of things isn't done. Not until everything is signed, witnessed, and maybe carved into a bit of wood for safekeeping. You wipe your hands on your tunic and stand just as the music picks up again. It's almost time for what you suspect will be the most uncomfortable part of the entire day. But first, there's a little more performance to get through. A few awkward dances, some more drinking. A crude joke or two yelled across the yard by a cousin who thinks he's hilarious. You smile through it all because you're playing a part now, and the script was written centuries before you were born. One of the older women, someone's grandmother, leans over to give you a toothless smile. "Strong hips," she mutters approvingly. "You'll make fine babies." You blink. Say thank you. Try not to cry. It's a compliment in context, you think. The final toast is raised. The table's nearly empty now, just crumbs, bones, and the remains of a pie that might have contained raisins, possibly gravel. Your father clasps the hand of your new in-law, grinning like he just brokered peace between kingdoms, which in a way he has. You've done your duty. The guests are full. The contracts are spoken and mostly understood. And now comes the night. It starts with a joke. Of course it does. One of the groomsmen, or maybe he's just a neighbour who decided this was his moment, makes some exaggerated remark about the bedding. Something about warming the sheets before the frost comes. Everyone laughs, loud and a little forced. You smile, but your face is frozen. Your fingers twitch in your lap. This part you've been dreading, and now it's here. The bedding ceremony. Nothing prepares you for it. Not the advice whispered by older cousins. Not the awkward glances from your mother. Not even that old bawdy song the lute player keeps repeating like it's the only one he knows. This is less a wedding tradition and more like a medieval trust fall, except you fall into a bed with a stranger, and half the village is standing around to make sure you do it. They bring you both indoors. Finally. It's someone's loft, recently scrubbed and covered with rushes to make it feel special. There's a bed at the centre, or at least the medieval version of one, wooden slats with a straw, mattress and a blanket that smells like damp linen and smoke. A single beeswax candle flickers on a nearby stool. The shadows dance in ways you'd rather not think about. Then comes the procession. Yes, it's a literal thing. Guests crowd into the small space, jostling for a look. Some cheer, some chant. A few women begin to sing a tune that has the word virgin in it, far too many times for your comfort. You glance at your new spouse, who looks equally horrified. This is normal, this is expected, and incredibly, this is considered wholesome. Now, depending on the region and the century, this ceremony could vary wildly. In some areas, the couple is simply led to the bedchamber, blessed and left alone. In others, the bedding gets dramatically theatrical. Guests might help remove your shoes, your clothes too if things really go off the rails. They might tuck you in like a child, pull the curtains shut and then file out with much giggling and wine spilling. Sometimes, though, people stayed. Yep, stayed. As in, lingered around the bed to witness or at least hear consummation. The sound of it, the implication, a grunt, a giggle, the rustling of sheets. And here's the twisted part. This wasn't about perversion, it was legal protection. Consummation sealed the deal. You could say your vows in front of every priest in Christendom, but without that final act, the marriage was vulnerable. Anyone with a grudge or a competing claim to property could challenge your union. A marriage that wasn't consummated could be annulled. Your future could be legally unravelled if you didn't, do it. A surprising number of marriage disputes from the time revolve around whether or not the couple ever lay together. There are actual court records from the 14th and 15th centuries featuring testimonies from in-laws, servants, and even landlords discussing suspiciously clean bed linens or mysteriously silent wedding nights. There are trials where judges inspect clothing, quiz witnesses, and try to figure out if two people actually had sex without ever having seen them in the same room. You lie down slowly, still in your wedding tunic, praying they don't expect a strip show. Thankfully, the guests are mostly satisfied just to tuck the covers around you both and sing a few more verses of something that sounds like a drinking ballad, but keeps name-dropping saints. One woman tosses a sprig of rosemary onto the bed for fertility. Someone else leaves a jar of something sticky that you really, really hope is honey. Finally, the priest mumbles a blessing and leaves. The door creaks shut. The latch clicks. Silence. You lie there, stiff as a corpse, staring at the ceiling. Your spouse sighs beside you. Then softly they whisper, "That was horrible." You laugh. Not because it's funny, but because the tension finally breaks. Maybe this person won't be so bad after all. But you're not quite in the clear. Tomorrow, people will talk. They'll want proof. In some households, that meant displaying the sheets, yes, actual bed linens, stained and wrinkled as evidence. Maids would parade them through the house like some grotesque banner of fertility. If there were no stains, you'd better hope for very understanding families or a well-faked nosebleed. This ritual was especially vital for the upper classes. When land, titles and inheritance were on the line, the bedding wasn't just tradition. It was political documentation. In certain noble houses, the bedding ceremony was attended by a court official whose entire job was to sit in the room, back turned, listening for signs of marital success. A grunted "Amen" was often enough. Quirky fact. In some French provinces, a small crowd would actually escort the couple to bed, clanging pots, singing songs, and making loud, suggestive noises meant to encourage the couple. It was part mockery, part celebration, part deeply weird community bonding. There's still debate among scholars about just how common or intense these rituals were. Some argue that most bedding ceremonies were symbolic. A brief walk to the bedroom, a kiss, a curtain drawn, and then everyone pretended they didn't know what came next. Others insist that the full spectacle, undressing, observing, listening, was fairly widespread, especially in rural communities where privacy was basically a myth. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, like most medieval realities, exaggerated, inconsistent, and heavily dependent on whose goat died that week. You eventually relax enough to speak. You and your new spouse whisper in the dark, sharing your awkwardness like war stories. Neither of you expected this to feel so theatrical, or so bizarre, but it's done. You did the thing, or didn't. You're too tired to care. Outside, the sounds of the feast die down. A rooster crows again, absurdly early. Or late. You shift beneath the scratchy blanket, eyes fluttering closed. This is your life now. You're married. Not because you fell in love. Not because of a magical proposal, but because someone needed your father's wool and your hips looked sturdy. Still, something about it isn't entirely awful. Maybe it's the softness in your new spouse's voice. Maybe it's the way the candle finally goes out with a pop and a curl of smoke, like the whole ridiculous day has been sealed in wax. Whatever it is, you finally drift off. The village sleeps. The bedding ceremony is complete. Tomorrow, your marriage becomes real, not through vows or witnesses or bloodstains, but through the quiet beginning of two people figuring out how to share a bed, a house, and eventually maybe a life. Morning rolls in like a cold slap. There's no gentle sunrise, no birdsong chorus, just a clattering outside, someone's cart losing a wheel maybe, and the acrid smell of boiled onions drifting through the cracks in the wooden shutters. You open your eyes and remember, you're married. It isn't a dream. Or if it is, it's one with too many witnesses and far too much goat. Your new spouse is still asleep beside you, mouth slightly open, snoring just a little, which is somehow both endearing and alarming. You blink up at the rafters and try to let that sink in. You, officially, are someone's spouse now, bound by vow, by bed, and by the somewhat creepy joy of the entire village. No time to linger. The house is already stirring, feet on creaky floorboards, voices murmuring about bread, cloth and church. You pull on your clothes, still dusty from last night, and brace yourself for the inevitable parade of well-wishers, judgmental uncles, and at least one elderly aunt who'll give you a wink and ask if you did your duty. Spoiler, she won't wait for an answer. That part is just for her amusement. Downstairs, the table's been reset. There's porridge, dry cheese, more of that cider that could double as a weapon. But more than anything, there's tension. Because now that the feast and the bedding are behind you, it's time for the real question. What does your marriage actually mean? And not in the mushy, emotional sense. In the legal, societal, and oh-so-medieval sense. See, at this point in history, say somewhere between the 11th and 13th centuries, the church is in the middle of a full-on identity crisis about what marriage even is. Is it a sacrament? A contract? Just a glorified handshake followed by shared sleeping quarters? It depends on who you ask. A local priest might tell you marriage is holy, blessed by God, and indissoluble. A baron with an eye on your father's land might argue it's merely a social contract, breakable, rearrangeable, and subject to convenient forgetfulness. And you're stuck in the middle, trying to understand how something so personal could be so publicly debated. Early medieval marriages weren't always church affairs. In fact, they often happened without a priest present at all. Two people could declare their consent, usually in front of witnesses, and that was enough. No ceremony, no Latin blessings, just I take you, and maybe a nod from the neighbour milking his cow in the background. That's it. Married. But as the centuries ticked by, the church started tightening its grip. At first it merely observed, then it began offering blessings, then it required public vows. Eventually, by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, the church declared that marriages had to be publicly announced in advance, hello wedding bands, and officiated by a priest for them to be considered valid. This wasn't just about piety, it was about control. Regulating marriage meant regulating inheritance, legitimacy, and conveniently, the moral behaviour of the entire Christian population. You take a seat at the edge of the table, trying to shake off the last wisps of sleep. Your spouse sits beside you, hair mussed and eyes puffy, nodding politely at whoever keeps sliding more porridge your way. You both know today will involve church, if only for appearances. The local priest, now slightly sobered from last night, will mumble a few prayers, maybe toss some holy water your direction, and declare the marriage blessed. And even if you already said your vows yesterday, the church still wants its say. Better late than never, right? And here's where it gets weird. Because in some parts of medieval Europe, private marriages, without a priest, without witnesses, without even clothes sometimes, were still technically valid. This was known as clandestine marriage, and it drove church officials absolutely up the wall. Couples would elope, make their own vows, and then reappear weeks later demanding legal recognition. Cue outrage. The church tried everything. Rules, threats, public shaming. But people kept finding ways to skirt the system. One quirky twist? In some places, couples would exchange vows in secret and then keep the marriage hidden until it was convenient to announce. This created an entire subculture of secretly married couples, walking around pretending to be single while technically sharing divine marital status. Imagine the chaos: jealous lovers, disputed inheritances, surprise husbands. Yes, this really happened. And to this day, scholars are still arguing about how enforceable those early marriages really were. Some insist they were legally binding, especially if there was proof of consummation. Others claim the Church's tightening regulations slowly delegitimized these informal unions over time. It's murky. Medieval record-keeping wasn't exactly obsessed with consistency. Back at the breakfast table, your father-in-law is discussing wheat yields with someone you think is a tax collector. Your new spouse is sipping cider and trying to avoid eye contact with your grandmother, who hasn't stopped staring since you came downstairs. You pretend to be fascinated by your porridge, which now tastes suspiciously like sadness and ash. Then comes the part no one likes talking about: the Church's opinion on sex, which in a word was complicated. On one hand, it was necessary. Marriage, after all, existed to produce children, preferably legitimate ones who wouldn't complicate inheritance laws. But on the other hand, sex was considered, well, kind of gross, necessary but sinful. The ideal marriage, according to some theologians, was one where sex only happened for procreation, never for pleasure, and certainly never on holy days, which, fun fact, made up over a third of the calendar. This meant newlyweds were often caught in a bizarre moral tug-of-war. You were expected to consummate your marriage immediately, but also avoid sinning while doing it. Some couples confessed their first night's activities to their priest. Others didn't bother, assuming God had better things to do than monitor their bedroom. You finish breakfast in silence. There's talk of attending Mass, of thanking God for a fruitful union, of walking through town so the neighbours can see the blessed couple. You'll do all of it, because in this world, where the line between public and private is almost invisible, your marriage is now part of the social fabric. People are watching, people are judging, and the Church is always, always listening. Still, somewhere in the ache behind your eyes and the fuzziness of too little sleep, you wonder what comes next. Will you and your spouse live together? Will you move in with their family? Will you start working side by side in the fields, or in the kitchen, or at the market stall? And when, exactly, does a marriage start to feel like a life? For now, there's just another day ahead, another round of chores, another round of prayers, and the faintest hope that things might, just might, become less awkward over time. By the time the afternoon bells chime from the church tower, you've already walked through 3 fields, dodged a goose with a vendetta, and answered the same question from half a dozen neighbours. So, how was the wedding night? They all ask with the same smirk, as if they expect a scandalous answer. You've learned to give the safe smile, a kind of non-committal shrug that says everything and nothing all at once. Your spouse does the same. It's teamwork, really. Early training for a life of shared glances and strategically vague answers. But in this moment, with dirt under your fingernails and sun on your face, you realise something important. It doesn't matter what you say. Because in medieval society, your marriage is already public property. People have decided what they think happened. They've got stories to tell, exaggerated details to share at the alehouse, and they're probably halfway through composing a crude rhyme about your honeymoon that will echo in your village for months. You don't own your reputation anymore. It's been handed over to the gossip mill and they don't offer refunds. And here's where things get really tricky. Because while everyone talks, what actually makes your marriage legally valid isn't the feast, or the bedding, or even the priest's half-drunken blessing. It's the vows. Specifically, the exchange of consent. If both of you said, "I take you" in the present tense, in front of witnesses, congratulations, you're married. Forever. No backing out, unless someone dies or the church finds a loophole. This strange, almost casual way of binding people together led to all kinds of chaos in medieval Europe. Imagine 2 teenagers sneaking off behind a barn, holding hands and whispering the magic words, "I take you as my spouse." If they were over the age of consent, which, by the way, was usually 12 for girls and 14 for boys, yikes, then boom, married, no ring, no priest, no parents' permission, just words, and if someone overheard them, that witness might be enough to start a legal storm. Naturally, parents hated this, lords hated this, The church really hated this. So around the 12th century, reformers started pushing back. They wanted clear rules, public ceremonies, priestly oversight. Not because they were against love necessarily, but because the old system was messy. Too many secret marriages, too many inheritance disputes, too many confused villagers claiming they were tricked into marriage because someone said the wrong thing at the wrong time. There's a particularly famous case from 14th century England where a young man claimed he accidentally married a girl because he said, "I will marry you," instead of "I would marry you." The judge didn't buy it. Marriage declared. Life changed. Hope you meant it, buddy. As you walk with your new spouse through the market square, you think about how absurdly fragile marriage really is. Just a few words, spoken aloud. Under the right circumstances, they bind you tighter than chains. And yet, because it's so simple, so accessible, people abused it constantly. Which is how the next layer of medieval marriage came to dominate. Community scrutiny. You pass a stall selling onions and dried herbs. The woman behind it, who definitely saw you both stumble home last night, smiles knowingly. "You two look cozy," she says, which is village code for, "We all know what happened." You nod politely and keep walking. That's the thing. No matter how private you think your life is, everyone's watching. Your marriage might be between two people legally, but socially, it involves everyone, and it goes both ways. If your neighbour's marriage is failing, it's your business. If someone's husband disappears into the forest and never returns, the village gets together to debate whether she can remarry. If someone marries too quickly after a spouse dies, tongues wag. Did she mourn long enough? Was it really an accident? Are we sure he's dead and not just hiding with that girl from the river path? This constant nosy community involvement acted as a strange kind of legal system. Think of it as medieval crowdsourced justice. Your marriage is upheld not just by priests and lords, but by the people who see you, every day, walking together, bickering over turnips, trying not to kill each other before Lent. But here's the quirky bit. It wasn't all suspicion and gossip. Sometimes community involvement protected people, especially women. If a man tried to deny he'd married a woman, the town could rise up, say, "We were there, we heard the vows," and boom, he's stuck. Likewise, if a woman was being mistreated, neighbours might intervene. The very people who snickered at your wedding feast might one day be the ones who save you from a bad situation. Still, there's one major point of debate among scholars. How much autonomy did people really have in medieval marriages? The church said marriages needed mutual consent. That sounds great, progressive even. But, in practice, many people were coerced, socially, economically, or even physically. A daughter might consent because her father threatened to send her to a convent. A son might agree to marry a rich widow because his family's drowning in debt. Consent was required, yes, but it was often complicated, layered with pressure and unspoken expectations. You stop near a fountain where children are splashing around, screeching in delight, and watch your spouse kneel to refill a water jug. There's something quietly intimate about it, the domestic ritual, the simple act of gathering water together. No witnesses, no priest, just the beginning of a shared rhythm. That's the reality most people lived with. Not ballads, not knights and ladies, just two people trying to make a life out of obligation, ceremony, and maybe eventually something resembling affection. Most marriages weren't passionate or poetic. They were cooperative, functional, strategic. You needed someone to hold the roof beam while you patched it, someone to wash the linens while you stirred the stew, someone to help when the harvest was bad or when a cough turned into something worse. As the sun starts to dip again, casting golden light over the village square, you realise no one's going to write songs about your marriage. There won't be troubadours or tapestries, but you're still here, still standing, still learning how to exist alongside another person you barely knew a week ago, and that, in its own quiet, unglamorous way, is a kind of epic. You're standing in front of a wooden chest trying to decide which tunic makes you look least like you slept in a barn. Because tonight there's another feast, this one hosted by your in-laws, and while it's supposedly casual, everyone knows the second feast is the one where the real judgments begin. The wedding might be over, but the social performance is not. You've entered a whole new chapter of marriage, the phase where everyone dissects your appearance, your attitude, and, if they've had enough ale, your posture in bed. You pull out your better tunic. It's dyed a dull blue and still smells faintly of lavender, which is fancy talk for not covered in goat hair. Your spouse emerges from the next room wearing what looks like their best outfit too, a brown wool ensemble with decorative stitching at the collar. It's not extravagant, but it's well made, and in medieval society that's everything. See, your wedding clothes aren't just clothes, they're statements. Status, wealth, family pride, all wrapped up in wool, linen, and the occasional piece of embroidery. Forget white dresses and tuxedos, that's not medieval. White isn't even a practical colour in a world without bleach. Instead, people wore their best, which often meant whatever was clean, mended, and didn't make them look like they fought a squirrel to get dressed. Among peasants, this meant serviceable linen, maybe dyed if they had a little money. Brown, blue, and dull greens were popular, colours that came from local plants and didn't require costly imports. A blue dress, for example, might signal modest wealth, since the dye came from woad and took time to produce. And if you showed up in plain beige or undyed wool, that was its own statement. I have no money, but I'm still here, and I brought cheese. For tradespeople and minor nobility, wedding wear could be more ornate. Grooms might don short cloaks with fur trim or wear a belt with tiny metal studs, practical bling. Brides, meanwhile, might decorate their veils with beads or tie bright ribbons around their waist. Shoes, often the most telling item, range from plain leather to elaborate, pointed disasters that screamed, "I don't work in the fields." Nobles, though, that's where things got absurd. Rich fabrics like silk or brocade, imported and expensive, might make an appearance. Layers of finely woven linen under tunics dyed with imported pigments. Belts with silver clasps. Cloaks lined with squirrel fur. Yes, squirrel. And don't laugh. Grey squirrel was a symbol of nobility for a while. If your outfit rustled when you walked or shimmered in candlelight, congratulations. You were royalty or dangerously close to bankrupt. You fasten your belt and smooth the creases in your tunic, glancing at your spouse. They smile awkwardly, and you both know this next social event isn't about eating, it's about being seen. Because medieval weddings weren't a single-day affair. In some communities, the celebration stretched for 3 days, or even a week, depending on how much money the families had and how much wine the neighbours could consume before collapsing in someone's cowshed. And the outfits weren't just for show. They served symbolic purposes. A special belt given to the bride might signify chastity, or fertility, depending on who you asked. A veil might suggest purity or simply function as a way to keep smoke out of your eyes while standing near the cooking fire. Jewellery, when available, was passed down through generations and carried immense weight. That brooch you're wearing, it might have belonged to your great-grandmother who used it to secure her cloak during childbirth. Practical heirlooms, baby. Here's the quirky bit of the night. In some parts of medieval Europe, especially Scandinavia, brides wore crowns, actual metal crowns, made of silver, decorated with tiny bells or beads. These weren't just pretty, they were heavy, uncomfortable, and designed to show everyone in the village that you were legally, publicly, unarguably off the market. The jingling was half celebration, half warning. Hands off, she's married now. Also, she might be armed with pins. You and your spouse walk the short path to your in-laws' hall. It's a modest building, wooden beams overhead, a long hearth running through the middle. Inside, the table is already set and the smells are much better than yesterday. Roasted leeks, honey-glazed carrots, maybe even a little fish. Someone spent all day cooking, which you're grateful for because your stomach's been growling since mid-morning. People turn as you enter. Some nod. A few smile. One woman gasps and mutters, "That tunic," under her breath in a way that's either admiration or thinly veiled disdain. This too is part of the ritual. Everyone here has an opinion on how you look, and how much you should have looked like. Because in a world without mirrors, without Instagram, and without stylists, weddings were rare public showcases. The one time you got to say, "Look at me. I exist. I have clean clothes and maybe even a clasp on my belt." You sit near the hearth, your spouse across from you. Someone places a trencher of bread between you, and you both begin the slow, awkward dance of eating, smiling, and fielding small talk. "Lovely couple," someone says. "Strong chin," another adds, which is apparently a compliment. You nod, thank them, try not to choke on your fish. But here's a fascinating historical debate still circling among scholars. Did people dress up for the wedding, or did they just wear what they had? Some historians argue that medieval peasants had no special occasion clothing. just 2 or 3 outfits worn in rotation. Others suggest that even the poorest tried to borrow, barter, or sew something nicer for the ceremony, knowing how important first impressions were. The truth? Likely somewhere in between. People valued presentation, but they also valued not starving. If you had a choice between new boots and winter grain, you picked the grain, but maybe added a flower to your old boots just for flair. As the evening wears on, the fire crackles, the shadows grow deeper, and the mood shifts from scrutiny to celebration. Someone plays a fiddle. A few of the braver souls start to dance, stomping rhythms into the packed earth floor. Your spouse offers a hand. You hesitate, then take it. It's not elegant. You step on their foot twice, but you both laugh, and for a moment the clothes, the comments, the pressure, they all blur into something that feels vaguely like joy. You're twirling now. Awkward but committed. Your tunic flaring out as the firelight catches the edges of your sleeves. This is marriage too, not just the vows or the bedding or the porridge. It's the way your sleeve brushes your spouse's, the way they mouth a joke across the table, the way, despite everything, you've started to look like a pair. The day after the second feast starts earlier than you'd like. You wake to the sound of someone shouting about a missing goat and the unmistakable squelch of someone else stepping in something regrettable. You stretch under a blanket that smells faintly of smoke and roasted onions, yawn like a creaking door, and rise into a room already full of movement. Someone's cousin is chasing a chicken through the courtyard. A pot is boiling over in the hearth. And through it all, you remember, you're still married. Today, though, things get even more interesting. There's talk of finishing the wedding rites at a church. Yes, another ceremony. No, this isn't a glitch in the schedule. See, where your marriage happens can change everything. And in medieval Europe, weddings didn't always take place where you think. You might imagine soaring cathedrals, stained glass windows, and a choir humming in Latin, while a solemn priest asks if anyone objects. Forget that. For most people, the location of a wedding depended entirely on social class, local custom, and whether or not the priest could be bothered to show up on time. If you're a peasant or a tradesperson, your wedding might happen in your own front yard, or in the market square, or literally at the crossroads outside town. The goal was visibility. People had to see the vows happen to confirm them later if necessary. So public places were ideal. The idea of the church as the central wedding spot wasn't locked in until the church got pushy about it. Even then, many folks still got married at the door. Yes, the literal doorstep of the church, rather than inside it. You and your spouse walk side by side toward the village church, which sits slightly lopsided at the edge of town, its stone walls mossy and leaning like an old drunk. The door creaks open to reveal a cold, shadowed interior that smells of dust and candle wax. A few benches are scattered inside, along with a stone altar and a collection of broken hymn boards. But despite the gloom, this is a sacred place, or at least a convenient one. The priest, who has miraculously sobered up since the last feast, is waiting in full vestments. He's not smiling, but that might just be his face. He nods once, holds out a weathered hand, and begins the rite. Latin flows from his mouth in a slow, practiced rhythm. You catch maybe one word in 10, but you nod in the right places. Your spouse does too. This version of the ceremony is more structured than your first one. There are defined responses, scripture readings, a vague warning about the fires of hell, and something about obedience you're pretty sure was aimed directly at you. Rings, if you have them, might be exchanged now, but remember, not everyone did. Rings were expensive. For poorer couples, a twist of cloth, a handshake, or even the symbolic passing of a knife could stand in, and the location itself is symbolic. Inside the church means divine blessing. Outside the door, also fine, as long as people are watching. In fact, outdoor weddings were considered more legally binding in many communities because they had more witnesses. You can't claim you never said your vows if half the village saw you do it between the cabbage stalls and the pig pen. Quirky detail. In parts of medieval France and England, couples were sometimes married in cemeteries. Yes, cemeteries. Right outside the church, often. Just a few paces from the graves. The idea was that marriage was a serious lifelong commitment, so serious that it deserved the solemn backdrop of death itself. You and your beloved promising to love each other until one of you joins the bones underfoot. Romantic, in a grim sort of way. The priest finishes his prayer and gives a final blessing, splashing holy water in a wide arc that dampens your sleeves. Someone coughs behind you, a baby cries, but it's done. Your union now bears the seal of the church, official, spiritual, and difficult to undo, and that's exactly what the church wanted. Control, influence, permanence. By insisting on church weddings, priests weren't just blessing unions, they were documenting them. That mattered a lot in a world where people could vanish, get remarried, or claim they were never truly married to begin with. If the priest recorded your vows in the parish book, that was your receipt. Proof you belonged to someone. Proof your future children were legitimate. And, in a cruel twist, proof that you couldn't easily get out of it later. Historians still argue over how common church weddings really were in the early medieval period. Some insist they were rare, limited to the upper classes or those living close to a monastery. Others argue that church involvement gradually filtered down to everyday folks by the 12th century. There's no clear answer, just fragments of records, scattered mentions in letters, and one very sarcastic monk's diary entry complaining about how many couples kept skipping the priest entirely. As you leave the church, blinking in the sudden sunlight, you realise just how long the whole affair took. Hours, maybe. Or maybe it just felt that way because of the hard benches and the icy drafts. Your stomach growls. Your spouse looks like they're calculating whether there's still bread left from yesterday's feast. You both start walking home. The village seems quieter today. Fewer eyes on you. Fewer whispers. Your neighbours have other things to do now. Fields to tend, goods to trade, gossip to swap about someone else's marriage. You've had your spotlight. Now it's time to settle into whatever this union is supposed to be. A partnership? An obligation? A survival strategy? For now, it's just the two of you walking side by side, half listening to the wind in the trees and the distant bleating of that same angry goat from earlier. Your hands brush once, not on purpose, but you don't pull away. You just keep walking. You make it back home just in time to see a woman chasing her toddler across your shared courtyard, with a half-peeled turnip in one hand and a shoe in the other. The scene is chaotic, but it barely registers anymore. That's the thing about marriage in the Middle Ages. No honeymoon, no break, no quiet week in the countryside to decompress. You're immediately folded into the rhythms of daily life. Yesterday you were the child of someone else's household. Today you're expected to behave like you've been running your own since birth. But at least there's food. You enter the hall where preparations for yet another meal are underway. This one is smaller. Just family. Maybe a few lingering guests who didn't get the hint to leave. You and your spouse are seated near the hearth again. Not in the place of honour this time, but close enough to be under constant observation. Everything you do is still being catalogued. How you chew, how you speak, how often you glance at each other. You pick up a spoon of stew like it's a diplomatic gesture. The food itself is humble. This is not the showy spread from the first feast. There's coarse bread, root vegetables, a bit of dried meat soaked in broth. A jug of thin ale makes the rounds, and someone passes around a soft cheese wrapped in leaves. If you're lucky, there's a meat pie. Possibly rabbit, possibly pigeon, possibly something that fell into a trap and stopped moving long enough to become edible. But you eat gratefully, because this too is part of marriage. Shared meals, shared labour, shared calories scraped together in a world where food security is never a guarantee. Medieval wedding feasts were a strange beast. Some lasted a single night. Others sprawled across several days, especially if the families involved were wealthy or influential. The length and extravagance of the celebration often reflected social rank and political stakes. A peasant wedding might include 2 meals and a jug of cider. A noble wedding could go on for 5 straight days with dancing, hunting, and courses served in waves. Fish, then fowl, then whole boars roasted over open flames, their snouts stuffed with herbs like they were going to the prom. And then there were the entremets, those theatrical, ridiculous, sometimes bizarre dishes served between courses purely to impress or confuse. Peacocks roasted and then redressed in their own feathers. Pies that exploded with live birds when cut open. Sculptures made entirely of sugar or dough. If you're a royal, your wedding feast is an edible fever dream designed to make visiting nobles gasp and peasants weep from jealousy. But back in your world, the dusty, cabbage-scented world of regular people, wedding feasts are more practical. Everyone contributes something. Aunt Matilda brings her questionable leek stew. The baker donates a loaf that could break a window. The local brewer might part with a keg if your family's in his good graces. These feasts are community events tied to the seasons and the harvest. In a good year there's abundance. In a bad one, everyone chews slowly and pretends they're full, and don't think you get to just sit and eat. The newlyweds are expected to perform, not just in the wedding night sense, though definitely that, but socially, dancing, hosting, responding to toasts, smiling like your jaw isn't cramping. Sometimes you're even expected to sing. Yes, sing. A little ditty, maybe a love song, maybe a bawdy verse if your village leans that way. If you don't sing, someone will sing for you, and that's worse. You glance down the table and catch your spouse mid-sip. They raise their cup slightly. You nod. This little gesture, this tiny moment of acknowledgement, feels like a victory. You don't know what's coming next, but at least you're not alone in it. Here's something funny. The role of food in marriage went well beyond the feast. In many parts of Europe there was a ritual involving bread and salt, symbols of nourishment and preservation. A couple might break bread together as a symbol of shared sustenance, or place salt on their tongue to represent endurance. Romantic, in a grim, sodium-heavy way, yes, and quirky fact of the night. In some Germanic traditions, newlyweds were given a wedding beer brewed just for them. It was a strong, sometimes spiced brew meant to get them through their first week of marriage. If it didn't knock you out, it might at least make you forget how hard it is to share a bed with someone who steals all the blankets and mutters in their sleep. Of course, scholars still debate the importance of feasts as legal signifiers. Was the wedding feast just celebration, or did it count as evidence of a valid marriage? In certain areas, the meal was taken as proof that the community accepted the union. No feast? Maybe no real wedding. Some argue this was a holdover from older tribal customs, where communal recognition mattered more than clerical blessing. Others say it's just a tradition that grew because everyone likes an excuse to drink. As the meal ends, people begin to drift out, patting your shoulder, offering last-minute advice, or just grinning at you like you're some exotic new breed of livestock. You help clear the table. Your spouse carries out the last jug of ale. There's no formal end to the event, just the gradual exhale of people returning to their regular lives. The hall grows quiet. The hearth crackles. You sit beside your spouse again, closer now. Not because anyone's watching, but because the air is finally still. For the first time, no one is asking questions or offering bread or making jokes. It's just the two of you, married, tired, and full of food that, for better or worse, you'll both remember for a very long time. And that's the thing about medieval weddings. Not just the vows, not just the customs, but the quiet aftermath. The reality of two people, unsure of what they're doing, trying to build something in a world that never really slows down. There's no instruction manual, just traditions, prayers, and the hope that love might follow, eventually, like smoke drifting up from a dying fire. Night again. The second, or is it the third now, since your wedding? Time is starting to stretch in that strange way it does when everything around you is new and yet immediately exhausting. You sit by the hearth, poking at a log with a stick, watching it collapse into glowing embers. Your spouse is nearby, combing tangles from their hair with a carved wooden comb, silent but present. It's comfortable, or at least less uncomfortable than before, which, in this world, is practically a love story. And speaking of love stories, let's talk about what actually happens on the wedding night. Not in the romantic, rose-petal way people might fantasize about, but the real, awkward, often mortifying reality of medieval consummation. Because this is where marriage moves from symbolic to physical, from you said the words to you sealed the deal. And if that sealing didn't happen, well, your entire union could be considered unfinished, incomplete, invalid even. It starts with the bed. The same straw mattress you've been sleeping on since childhood, or maybe a nicer one borrowed from a cousin for the occasion. It's lumpy, it squeaks, it smells vaguely of mildew and whatever animal last nested inside it. A thin linen sheet drapes over it, recently washed but never quite clean. The room is dark, but not entirely. There's always a candle, always a bit of moonlight squeezing through the wooden shutters, and depending on your family's traditions, or your guests' lack of boundaries, you might not be alone. Welcome to the witnessing part of medieval marriage. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. In some regions and time periods, witnesses were expected to observe the consummation, not directly, usually, but close enough to confirm that something probably happened. The idea was that sex created the physical and spiritual bond of marriage. Without it, you were basically roommates with matching rings. And if someone wanted to challenge the legitimacy of your union, say, because of inheritance rights or political grudges, they could argue that your marriage never really existed. So what do these witnesses do? Sometimes they escort the couple to the bedchamber, offer prayers, and then retreat just beyond the curtain or door. Other times, they stay in the room, eyes politely turned to the ceiling, ears tuned like hawks. In some noble households, this was a formal job. A lady-in-waiting, a chamberlain, or even a priest might be present, not to leer, but to listen, to ensure the sacred deed was completed in full compliance with social and religious expectations. You shift in your seat by the fire, grateful that your village leans toward the escort and pray model rather than the audible confirmation one. But still there was that group of uncles hovering outside the room, making suspiciously loud jokes and holding mugs of ale like they were waiting for applause. You haven't spoken of it since, and you're both hoping no one brings it up again. Ever. The act itself? Often clumsy, especially if neither party has much experience. Sex education didn't exactly exist, unless you count vague metaphors from elderly relatives or wildly inaccurate church sermons that painted desire as a necessary evil. For many, the wedding night was confusing, painful, or just plain weird. Expectations were high, realities were less so, and yet this moment, awkward and nerve-wracking as it was, held enormous weight. Because once consummated, the marriage became legally and religiously indissoluble in most cases, even if you hated each other, even if one of you vanished into the woods tomorrow. That one act bound you together in a way that no priest, no parchment, no feast could match. There's a case from 15th century Italy where a young noblewoman married a man who promptly left for a crusade before consummating the union. Years later, she wanted out. The courts asked for proof. Had they shared a bed? Were there witnesses? Was there blood on the sheets? The family produced testimony from servants who insisted the couple had lain together with great devotion. Marriage confirmed. Escape denied. That brings us to another common custom, the displaying of the bed sheets. Yes, again. In many areas, after the first night, the couple's sheets were inspected for signs of consummation, usually blood, which was expected as proof of virginity. If there was blood, it was paraded around. If there wasn't, things got tricky. Of course, not every woman bleeds the first time, but try explaining that to a group of villagers holding torches and opinions. And here's the quirky fact. In some households, they faked it. A drop of animal blood, carefully dabbed, or a slight nosebleed encouraged with a pinch. Because better a fabricated stain than a real scandal. Medieval people weren't stupid. They knew how to protect reputations, even if it meant bending the truth a little. Even today, scholars debate the prevalence and seriousness of these bedding rituals. Were they truly performed in every village, in every class? Or were they exaggerated by chroniclers who wanted to shock or impress their readers? It's likely that practices varied widely. What was normal in one region might be unthinkable in another. The one constant was the belief that consummation mattered, both spiritually and legally. You glance across the room at your spouse, now curled up under a blanket, half asleep, face illuminated by the dying fire. You think of that first night, not in vivid detail, but in emotional tones. The tension, the quiet relief when it was over, the unspoken agreement to never ever discuss it again. Not because it was terrible, just because it was yours, private, sacred in the messiest, most human way. Outside, the wind picks up, rustling through the thatched roof. The village is dark now, only the faint glow of distant candles marking other homes where other couples are settling into this same strange new rhythm, all of them performing the quiet rituals of marriage, eating, working, lying side by side and wondering what tomorrow will bring. And for you, tomorrow is just that. A new day, another chance to get it right, or at least to avoid public humiliation. That's love, medieval style. The next morning comes quietly, as if the entire village knows you need a break from celebration, commentary, and suggestive toasts. The rooster, shockingly, sleeps in. You wake before your spouse, slipping out from under the blanket with the care of someone defusing a bomb. The air is cool, the hearth has gone cold. And outside the shutters, you hear the distant creak of a cartwheel and the slap of wet laundry on stone. The world moves on, even when your whole life has been flipped sideways by a few vows and a lot of ale. You walk through the house slowly, taking stock. Everything looks the same, but nothing feels the same. That's one of the oddest parts of medieval marriage. How abruptly you go from individual to unit. Just yesterday you were your father's child. Today you're a spouse, a co-manager of goats, a potential parent, an asset in a family strategy that might involve land, produce, or surviving the next flood season. There's no adjustment period, no grace window. You're expected to become a functioning married adult overnight. And that transformation hinges on one crucial thing: whether the marriage has been consummated. You think of last night again. No interruptions, no spectators, no bloodied linens waved like victory banners. Just two awkward people doing their best under pressure neither of you fully understands. You think quietly that maybe you're lucky, that even without poetry or moonlight, what you shared was real enough to count. But in many parts of medieval Europe, it wasn't enough for it to feel real. It had to be proven. And that's where the bedding witnesses came in. Not just people watching you walk into the bedchamber, but people verifying, later and often publicly, that the act itself had taken place. This was especially true in noble families, where political alliances hinged on the permanence of a union. A marriage that hadn't been consummated could be declared void. A bride whose virginity was questioned could find her entire dowry called into dispute. The expectations were clear. Your body wasn't just your own anymore, it was evidence. And your witnesses? They were the ones who'd make sure that evidence held up. Sometimes these witnesses were family members, sisters, cousins, or trusted older women. Sometimes they were religious figures, like priests or monks, who insisted on hearing confession immediately after consummation to confirm that it had occurred in a proper Christian manner, whatever that meant. In the most extreme cases, the community demanded proof. Sheets paraded through the village, songs sung about the bloody badge, and neighbours gossiping with the vigour usually reserved for actual wars. It sounds theatrical, and it was. But beneath the spectacle was a deep, often unsettling need for control. Control over lineage, over land, over legitimacy, and that control was enforced not just by the church or the law, but by the community itself. Everyone had a stake in whether or not your marriage was real, whether it would last, whether it would produce heirs who could take over your family's role in the village economy, however small. You light the fire and set a pot of water to heat, falling into the rhythm of morning work. Your spouse stirs behind you, yawns, and eventually joins you at the hearth, stretching and rubbing sleep from their eyes. Neither of you speaks about last night. You don't need to. There's a mutual understanding now, a kind of unspoken truce between strangers learning how to become something else, something functional. Later in the morning, someone knocks on your door. It's your aunt. Of course it is. She carries a bundle of cloth, some herbs, and a knowing smile that makes you want to melt into the floorboards. She doesn't ask for details. She just looks around the room, nods to herself and says, "Well then, time to get started." Started with what, you ask, half hoping it's something harmless like making soap or chasing chickens. Keeping the marriage strong, she replies, setting the cloth bundle down like it's a bag of secrets. You don't just tie the knot and walk away, you've got to tighten it every day. Which, in medieval terms, means doing the work. Running a household, sharing labour, negotiating roles without ever calling them negotiations, and yes, maintaining appearances. Because even if no one witnessed your wedding night directly, the village is watching now. They'll watch how you walk together, how you speak to each other, whether one of you flinches when the other moves. They're looking for signs, signs of happiness, signs of scandal, signs of failure. There's a quirky historical twist to all this. In some villages, if people suspected the marriage wasn't consummated, or if one spouse refused to consummate it, they could intervene, publicly. There are actual records of townspeople marching couples back into their bedroom, closing the door and standing outside until sufficient time had passed. In some cases, they even brought wine and candles to set the mood, because nothing says romance like a crowd of concerned neighbours urging you to just get it over with. And here's the scholarly debate. Did these rituals actually enforce marital unity, or did they just shame people into compliance? Some historians argue that the public nature of bedding and consummation helped build community trust, that in a world with so few legal safeguards, visibility was the only protection. Others say it was invasive, humiliating, and rooted in a deep mistrust of women's autonomy and men's honesty. You stir the pot over the fire, listening to it bubble and hiss. Your spouse is setting the table, slicing bread with careful, even strokes. It's quiet between you, but not uncomfortable, and you realise that while the community may be watching, they can't see this. The quiet labour, the silent moments, the slow growing of familiarity. That's the part of marriage no one witnesses, the part no one can confirm but the two of you. Still, your aunt lingers by the door, clearly waiting for something. A confession, a joke, a clue. You offer her a bowl of broth and say nothing. She takes it with a smile. Strong start, she says, and leaves. And maybe it is, or maybe it's just a beginning, like lighting the first fire in a long winter. You don't know where this road leads. You don't know what's waiting in the seasons to come. But for now, the marriage is real, witnessed, whispered about, confirmed. You have a name, a home, a partner, and, according to your aunt, a pretty decent knot. It's Sunday. You're walking slowly through the village, church-bound once again, your steps deliberate on the uneven path of packed earth and scattered straw. The bell in the squat stone tower rings out across the fields, low and insistent, and the scent of wood smoke drifts from chimneys like the village exhaling together. Your spouse walks beside you, tunic freshly brushed, hair tied back. You can feel the eyes on you, half curious, half judgmental. Newlyweds always draw attention, even after the bread's been eaten and the wine's gone flat. You're part of a new narrative now, and the church wants its say. But here's the strange part. For much of the medieval period, the church wasn't even required for your marriage to be real. It sounds bizarre today, especially after all the robes and incense and Latin chanting. But marriage in the early Middle Ages wasn't necessarily a church business. It was private. Two people could declare themselves married with just mutual consent and a couple of witnesses. The legal term for this was verba de praesenti, a present tense declaration of intent. You didn't need a priest. You didn't need a blessing. You didn't even need a ring. Just two voices agreeing in front of other people, and boom, done. Which worked well enough until it didn't. Because humans, being predictably messy, used the loopholes to their advantage. You could get secretly married, then deny it later. Or pretend to be married, then disappear with someone's dowry. Or claim you'd said the words when you hadn't. With no written contracts, no clerical oversight, it was your word against someone else's, and that led to a level of confusion even medieval scribes couldn't untangle. So the church stepped in, gradually at first like a neighbour offering helpful advice, then firmly, authoritatively. By the 12th century, bishops and reformers started demanding a greater role in the marital process. Marriage, they argued, was a sacrament, as holy as baptism or communion. That meant it needed regulation, ceremony and oversight. It wasn't just a social contract anymore. It was a divine one, witnessed not just by your neighbours, but by God. You and your spouse enter the dim, cool air of the church. Candles flicker along the stone walls, their wax dripping into old iron holders, while the priest recites the liturgy in a monotone that somehow makes eternal damnation sound like a suggestion. You slide into the same pew, side by side, surrounded by the smells of incense, damp stone, and sheep that someone didn't tether far enough from the door. The priest makes eye contact with you, longer than necessary, and raises his eyebrows just slightly before returning to his sermon. He's talking about fidelity, about marriage as a bond sanctified by the Lord. He warns of temptation, of straying, of letting the devil sneak in through the back door of your heart, or your bed. You resist the urge to glance at your spouse. You're not sure whether the speech is aimed at you directly, or just a boilerplate lecture for every newly married couple, with enough hormones to start a village scandal. But this shift in religious emphasis was real. After the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, church weddings became the standard. Banns, the public announcements of a couple's intent to marry, had to be read aloud 3 Sundays in a row before the ceremony. The goal was to allow time for any objections. Maybe someone knew the groom was already married. Maybe the bride was promised to another. Or maybe, more mundanely, their parents were second cousins and no one realised until it was too late. And here's where things got even stickier. Because once the church controlled marriage, it also controlled who could marry whom. Suddenly your personal relationship became subject to canon law, which included an alarming number of restrictions. You couldn't marry close relatives, obviously, but the definition of close stretched wide, sometimes too wide. Seventh cousins? Technically still within the prohibited degree depending on the region and interpretation. This led to a lot of surprises. You'd think you were safely wed, then find out from a visiting monk that your great-grandmother shared a surname with your spouse's uncle's cousin. Cue annulment, cue scandal, cue extremely awkward conversations about family trees. Still, the church offered some benefits. It provided a moral framework, at least in theory. Clerics preached about mutual respect in marriage, about faithfulness, about spiritual partnership. Some even advocated for the rights of women within marriage, warning husbands not to abuse their wives, reminding them that they too were accountable before God. Of course, this was more ideal than reality, but the intention was there, occasionally, on feast days. There's a quirky historical fact for you. Some priests, especially in rural parishes, were notorious for bungling marriages. They'd mispronounce vows, forget to bless the rings, or skip entire parts of the service. In one infamous 14th century case, a priest accidentally married the wrong couple. He confused two grooms who arrived at the same time. By the time it was sorted out, one of the brides was already 2 days into a new life with a man she didn't recognise. And yet, even with priests who couldn't remember names or read their own notes, the church had become the final word on whether your union was real. A blessing on the doorstep, a scribbled line in a parish book, and suddenly your entire legal and spiritual life was altered. Back in your pew, the sermon has ended. You rise with the congregation, kneel, stand again, recite the paternoster with the quiet monotony of a dozen sleepy farmers. When it's over, you step outside, blinking into the light. Someone offers you a nod, someone else offers a warning. Keep your husband out of the tavern. You smile politely, pretending you haven't already considered stuffing his shoes with nettles if he comes home drunk again. The rest of the day unfolds slowly. You and your spouse walk back through the village, past the market square, past the carts, past the same field where someone is perpetually digging for no clear reason. There's laundry to do, a fence to mend, a fire to stoke. Life resumes. And that's the real truth about church weddings in the Middle Ages. They weren't about flowers or romance or even faith, really. They were about structure, about putting marriage in a box with rules, requirements, and just enough divine fear to keep you from burning it all down. Whether that made marriage better or worse, that's still up for debate. But you've got work to do, so the question will have to wait. It's late again. That soft part of the evening when the fire turns low and the conversation drifts into half-mumbled nothings. You're sitting on a 3-legged stool, chewing a piece of tough bread that feels like it was baked back in the reign of Charlemagne. Your spouse is at the table across from you, stitching a tear in a sleeve, squinting in the dim glow of a tallow candle. You've gotten comfortable in this strange rhythm, still new, still tentative, but less like an act and more like a beginning. Which makes it a perfect time to talk about the one person at your wedding who had absolutely no chill. The priest. Even if your vows were said days ago, even if the marriage has been bedded, blessed and boasted about by every cousin and coward in town, the priest still has one more job to do. Explain what you've gotten yourself into, and not in some uplifting spiritual way. We're talking lectures, moralizing. Sometimes sermons that go on so long you can feel your grandchildren aging in the womb. Clergy in the Middle Ages took marriage seriously, not just as a sacrament, but as a social responsibility. The priest wasn't there just to bless your union. He was there to warn you, guide you, and occasionally scold you like a medieval marriage therapist with divine authority and an endless supply of guilt. Depending on your region and the priest's enthusiasm, level your marriage might be followed by a formal homily, a sort of spiritual what to expect when you're expecting to stay married forever. It could be delivered at your wedding feast, in church the following Sunday, or even in your home if the priest was feeling especially proactive or nosy. These lectures were often based on scripture, particularly the letters of St. Paul, and they covered all the greatest hits: fidelity, obedience, humility, patience, and of course, the ever-popular marriage as a safeguard against lust, but don't get too excited about it. You remember yours, or parts of it anyway. The priest's voice was a low drone, equal parts Latin chant and disappointed father figure. Let the husband render to the wife due benevolence, he'd said, drawing out each syllable like it weighed 100 pounds, and likewise the wife to the husband. He paused dramatically before adding, for it is better to marry than to burn. You tried not to make eye contact with anyone at the table during that line. Your spouse was busy refilling their cup of cider, a clear attempt to avoid choking on their bread. But it didn't stop there. The priest went on about Eve and original sin, about how wives should submit to their husbands as to the Lord, about how husbands should love their wives as Christ loved the church, which sounds beautiful until you remember how that story ends. He warned against gossip. He warned against idleness. He warned against using your spouse as a verbal punching bag, even if they forgot your favourite trencher at market. And this wasn't unusual. Priests had a whole toolkit of marital advice, some of it surprisingly reasonable. For example, some counselled husbands not to strike their wives, not just because it was morally wrong, but because a man who harms his wife harms himself. Others reminded couples to talk kindly to each other, to share food fairly, to maintain peace in the household for the sake of children, servants and livestock who didn't deserve to live in a constant storm of passive-aggressive sighing. But alongside the sensible came the strange. There were priests who taught that it was sinful for a husband and wife to enjoy physical intimacy too much, even within marriage, that certain positions were unholy, that sex during Lent, Advent or Sundays was a ticket to purgatory. The church had a whole calendar of when it was acceptable to lie together, and spoiler alert, it wasn't often. In total, over 100 days a year were considered off-limits. Imagine trying to plan around that with no wall calendar and no privacy. And here's the quirky twist. Some priests really leaned into their role as moral watchdogs. In a few particularly intense parishes, they'd show up at your door uninvited just to check that your marriage was running smoothly. In some places, they'd interrogate servants or neighbours for gossip. There are accounts of priests being invited to dinner and then launching into hour-long warnings about how the devil thrives in lazy marriages. You'd think they were jealous. Maybe they were. Even more oddly, some sermons treated marriage like a necessary evil, better than sin, but still a distraction from holiness. Celibacy, after all, was still the ideal. Monks and nuns were celebrated for their devotion. Married people, they were tolerated, cautiously, like someone who brings their muddy dog into the cathedral. Fine, you're here, but please don't touch anything. Scholars today still debate the true impact of these clerical lectures. Did people listen? Did they change their behaviour? Did they feel uplifted or just vaguely shamed into keeping their voices down at dinner? Some argue that priests had genuine influence, shaping how people understood their roles in marriage, even when those ideals clashed with the messy reality of daily life. Others think most people nodded politely during the sermons, then went home and did whatever they were going to do anyway. You sit back on your stool, rubbing your temples as the candle flickers lower. Your spouse finishes sewing and stretches with a quiet groan. "Do you think we're doing this right?" they ask, not joking. You blink. "The marriage?" They nod. "The being married part, the duties, the prayers, the way we're supposed to act." You think for a moment. Then you say, "I think as long as we're not trying to kill each other with a cooking spoon, we're ahead of the curve." They laugh. A real one, tired and warm. It lingers between you, a thread in the quiet. The fire cracks again. Outside, a dog barks at the moon, then gives up halfway through. You didn't marry for love. You didn't marry for holiness either. You married because it was expected, because your family needed it, because life in the Middle Ages doesn't wait for feelings. But maybe, just maybe, you're carving something out anyway. Something real, not saintly, not perfect, but yours. And if the priest decides to visit again tomorrow with more words about sin and structure, well, you'll offer him some bread, nod in all the right places, and then go back to figuring it out your own way. You're halfway through the week when someone's daughter runs into the village screaming that a bride has been taken. Taken, not married, not courted, but snatched right off the road near the blacksmith's barn and thrown across the saddle of some second son of a minor noble. You put down your spoon, blink, and look around the table to see if anyone else is taking this as seriously as you are. They are, but no one seems particularly shocked. Welcome to the utterly bonkers and surprisingly frequent phenomenon of marriage by abduction. Yes, it was a thing. And depending on where you lived, it wasn't always illegal. Or at least not treated like it was. In some places, it was practically a recognised method of getting married, especially if your family didn't approve of the match or if the groom lacked the dowry to make things legit. You lean against the doorway and watch the girl's mother cry into a neighbour's shawl, while someone organises a group to ride out and have a word with the abductor. The father is furious, shouting something about dishonour and wolves dressed as men, but it's also clear that if this gets smoothed over quickly, and if the groom makes the right promises, they might just let it stand. That's the strange part. The murky moral grey zone between actual violence and socially tolerated misbehaviour. Medieval marriage abduction wasn't always what you'd expect. Sometimes it was genuine kidnapping, violent, traumatic, condemned by the church and prosecuted by local authorities, assuming the family had the power to fight back. But other times, it was staged. A mock abduction. A planned elopement dressed up as a snatch and run to preserve reputations or bypass disapproving parents. In these cases, the bride often knew what was happening. Sometimes she helped plan it. Sometimes it was the only way she could marry the man she loved. Of course, the difference between a planned elopement and a real kidnapping could be a matter of perspective, and who had the louder voice in court? You ask your spouse quietly if they've ever known someone who was married this way. They nod slowly. Twice, they say. One girl disappeared, came back 6 months later with a baby and a limp. The other married the man who took her and laughed about it for 20 years. You stare at the fire, trying to picture that second woman. Whether the laugh was joy or survival. Probably both. In some regions, the church outright condemned abduction marriages. Canon law stated that a marriage had to be entered into freely by both parties. But enforcement was patchy. Local customs and noble privilege often trumped ecclesiastical hand-wringing. A powerful man could take a girl, hold her in his estate for a few days, and emerge claiming the deed was done and the vows were spoken. If her family was poor, or politically outmatched, they had little recourse. There are court records from the 14th century that make your stomach turn. A woman dragged across county lines, forced into a marriage she never consented to. Another whose brother testified she screamed the whole way. But then there are stories of couples who used the loophole to dodge family obligations. 2 teenagers vanishing in the night, returning with a priest and a marriage already sealed. People love to romanticize the boldness, the passion, the rebellion, but for every Romeo and Juliet there's a girl who never came home. And here's the strange, quirky twist. In some parts of Europe, especially Ireland and Scotland, abduction wasn't just common, it was ritualized. There were social codes around it. Rules. It was almost ceremonial. The groom and his friends would raid the bride's home, symbolically carry her off, and then negotiate with her family after the fact. It was theatre. Wild, sometimes cruel theatre, but theatre nonetheless. Still, scholars continue to debate the purpose of these abductions. Were they about love, control, or simply a workaround for complicated marriage politics? Some argue that the rise of strict church rules made traditional marriages harder to pull off, so people invented loopholes. Others suggest it was about asserting masculinity, proving dominance in a world where strength equaled legitimacy. Either way, it's unsettling. You spend the evening listening to the fallout. The girl hasn't been found yet, but a messenger was sent to the neighbouring manor and there's talk of involving the local bailiff. You hear her name whispered like a curse and a prayer. Her mother lights a candle in the church. Her father sharpens a blade. Her brother swears he'll bring her back or not come back at all. The community is divided. Some say she went willingly, others scoff and spit into the dirt. Everyone seems to agree it's a tragedy, but not everyone agrees on whose fault it is. You look at your spouse, who has gone quiet. You wonder what they would have done if someone had tried to marry them by force, if they'd gone quietly, if they'd fought, if they would have had a choice at all. And that's the heart of it. Choice. In theory, medieval marriages required consent, but in practice that consent was often coerced, rushed, or absent entirely, especially for women, especially for the poor, especially when power entered the room and took what it wanted. You think about your own marriage, awkward, arranged, and yet, somehow gentler than this. You had a bed, a feast, even a priest who remembered your name. You had time to speak your vows, even if they were more obligation than poetry. You had a say, or at least a quiet moment to nod. That girl, she didn't even get to finish breakfast. Night deepens. The fire burns low. Somewhere in the dark, dogs are barking. The search party is still out, torches bobbing like fireflies in the hills. You wrap your blanket tighter, inch closer to your spouse, and hold on to the uncomfortable truth that not every wedding ends with dancing. Some start with silence. Some never really start at all. The next market day arrives with more noise than usual, barrels rolling, chickens screaming, and a choir of merchants shouting prices like they're competing for your soul. You and your spouse are walking side by side, your basket swinging lightly from your arm, both of you trying to pretend that last night's drama didn't rattle your bones. The abducted bride still hasn't returned. Rumours swirl like chimney smoke. Some say she escaped. Others say she's already been married in a chapel no one can find. A few whisper that her family's pretending to search while quietly negotiating the dowry. You keep your head down. Because if there's one thing marriage has taught you in the past week, it's this. Not everything sacred looks like a church ceremony, especially not in the market square. Because right now, in the middle of muddy boots, fish guts and loaves of bread, the texture of roof tiles, a wedding is happening. Right there by the ale cart, between a woman selling onions and a man shouting about his goat's superior lineage. You blink twice just to make sure. But yes, there's a couple standing beside a barrel, holding hands, smiling nervously. A man in a rough robe, maybe a priest, maybe just someone with a deep voice and free time, is muttering a blessing. Two witnesses nod seriously, and then it's done. Married. You watch as the new couple kisses awkwardly. A few people clap. One drunk man shouts, "About time," before promptly tripping over a cabbage and falling into the gutter. It's chaotic, it's underwhelming, and it's 100% real. Welcome to the often overlooked world of street weddings, where love and legality collide in the dirt, and sometimes a pig walks through your vows. It turns out, for much of the medieval period, this kind of quick, semi-public, casually blessed marriage wasn't just common, it was legitimate. The church might have preferred weddings in chapels, with incense and Latin and long-winded lectures, but the law didn't require that yet. What mattered was mutual consent. If two people said the right words in the present tense, "I take you as my spouse," and if someone heard them, that was it. No scroll, no organ music, no floral arrangements, just "I do," said loud enough for a witness, and maybe a chicken to hear. This made the marketplace one of the most popular places to get married. Think about it. You've got witnesses, you've got space, and everyone you know will hear about it within 5 minutes whether they were there or not. Efficiency at its finest. In fact, some communities preferred street weddings for exactly that reason. They were visible, public, unmissable. No one could claim ignorance. No cousin could pop up later saying, "Wait, you married her? I thought she was betrothed to the guy with the 3-legged donkey." The street wedding made everything crystal clear right down to the mud stains on your wedding boots. There's a quirky detail for you. In some towns, especially in France and parts of England, couples stood in the doorway of their homes, or the bride's family's home, to say their vows, literally in the doorframe. It symbolised the transition between households, between childhood and adulthood, between mine and ours. Sometimes the priest would meet them there, say a few words, and then leave before dinner. No indoor ceremony, no pews, just words at the threshold. Simple, efficient, holy enough. And while the church eventually tightened control, especially after the 13th century, there was always a lag between law and practice. Rural communities held onto older customs. Market square weddings, doorway vows, and impromptu betrothals still happened, often without official approval. But that didn't stop people, because in the Middle Ages, survival didn't wait for permission. As you make your way through the market, the newlywed couple disappears into the crowd. Someone throws a crust of bread at them. A woman tosses a flower that was probably meant for her pig. It's weirdly moving in a slapstick kind of way. You glance at your spouse, who just shakes their head and smiles. "Honestly," they mutter, "that looked easier than ours." You laugh, because it's true. No lectures, no goat-stewed relatives. Just a promise made in public, in the most honest place there is. A market where everyone is buying, selling, shouting, and watching. Of course, this kind of visible, low-frill marriage also came with risks. Since it didn't involve a formal church setting, records were scarce. If your spouse disappeared or denied the union, you had to rely on witnesses, which meant that drunk man near the cabbage might be your legal defence someday. Not ideal. And here's the scholarly debate. Did these simple marriages actually offer more freedom? Some historians argue yes, especially for women. Without the need for parental consent or dowry negotiations, two people could, in theory, claim each other and start a life. It democratized marriage. made it accessible, romantic even. Others disagree. They say these street weddings left people vulnerable, especially the poorer classes. Without a priest's blessing or written proof, your marriage could be contested. If your partner wanted to ditch you later for someone with better land, what recourse did you have? Just the memory of a vow said over onions? Still, people did it. A lot. Not because they didn't care, but because they did. They wanted to be married, to start their lives together, to plant their flag in the community, even if all they had was each other, a witness, and the smell of drying fish. You stop at a stall selling candles and barter 3 eggs for a stubby bundle of tallow tapers. You and your spouse move as a unit now, silent nods, shared looks, the rhythm of decision-making that has begun to settle between you. You don't speak about it. You don't need to. It's a kind of shorthand. The language of marriage that isn't taught by priests or written in vows, but learned slowly, like a song hummed from memory. On the walk home, you pass the girl with the goat again. She's singing about the newlyweds, some improvised verse about fish guts and love, and your spouse winces. Let's never get married in a market, they say. You grin. We already did, kind of, they blink. When? First time we argued over the price of cheese together, everyone saw. And just like that, laughter replaces memory. The tension loosens, and you both keep walking, past the barrels, past the gossip, into the rest of your life. You don't wake up to birdsong. You wake up to the sound of hooves, lots of them. The kind that means someone important has arrived and wants everyone to know it. You peek out through the wooden shutters and nearly fall over. There's a parade of horses, men in cloaks, and servants bustling around with silks and bolts of cloth, colours so bright they look illegal. At the centre of it all, a tall man with too many rings and a face that says he's never had to fetch his own bucket of water. You blink. Then you spot the banner. It's the crest of a noble house, a big one, which means there's going to be a wedding, a noble wedding. You turn back inside, half in awe, half deeply annoyed that someone else's marriage is about to cause a week's worth of chaos. Because when the elite get married in the Middle Ages, they do not keep it quiet. They do not keep it simple. They do not do anything without trumpets and a suspicious number of dead animals roasting on spits. You and your spouse shuffle outside with the rest of the village. Already word is spreading. A local lord's son is marrying a duke's daughter, and the entire countryside is expected to drop everything and pretend they're thrilled. You spot the servants setting up tents the size of barns, unloading carts stacked with barrels of wine and gold-gilded goblets. They're building a platform in the square, and rumour has it a team of dancers is coming in from the city. You blink again. There's a man juggling fire. This is no wedding. This is political theatre with snacks. And that's exactly what noble marriages were. Not about love, rarely about happiness, and never about privacy. These were contracts of strategy, mergers of bloodlines, deals sealed with kisses and backed by armies. From the outside it looks glamorous. Cloaks of velvet, golden brooches, veils that trail across the ground like waves of silk. But inside, it's a pressure cooker. The bride has probably been traded like a prized cow. The groom may have met her once, maybe. This marriage isn't about compatibility. It's about land, dowries, war prevention, or sometimes war encouragement depending on who's making the vows. This particular couple you hear has never exchanged a word. She's from the coast, used to oysters and embroidery. He's from the woods, used to hunting boars and dodging assassination attempts. Perfect match. You sidle closer to the other villagers gathered near the growing feast area. Someone's already roasting a boar, and a pastry the size of your torso is being carried on a plank by 2 men who look like they regret their life choices. The noble wedding is already reshaping your entire week. The village is now a backdrop. You're now extras. This marriage is a performance, and you're holding the props. At the core of it all stands the bride, unveiled, dressed in a gown that must have taken 50 fingers and half a kingdom's income to make. Her sleeves are so long they nearly sweep the ground, and her headdress makes her look like she's preparing for takeoff. You can't see her face clearly, but you imagine she's mastered the vacant look of polite resignation. That, or she's meditating on how long she can hold her breath before fainting, becomes a political statement. The ceremony takes place at the temporary altar built just for the occasion, because why use a perfectly good church when you can commission a marble platform in the middle of your peasant neighbour's barley patch? There are bishops involved. Yes, plural. Choir boys in matching tunics. A man with a scroll that might be longer than your entire street. Latin is sung, shouted, whispered, and scrawled. Rings are exchanged that probably cost more than your entire house and goat combined. There's even a relic being paraded through the crowd, because apparently since someone's finger bone really brings a wedding together. Quirky fact: in some noble ceremonies, relics were included not just as blessings, but as a form of witness. Like, hey, this mummified saint's thumb says you're legally bound forever. Some couples even touch the relic while making their vows, because if you're lying in front of God and a dead holy man's ankle, that's just bad spiritual insurance. After the vows, the feast begins, and when nobility feasts, they feast hard. You see dishes you can't name, flavours you've never imagined, swans cooked in saffron, pies filled with spices from lands you've only heard about in market gossip. A tower of fruit in piles, is erected on the main table. Sugar sculptures melt slowly in the sun, shaped like lions, castles, and probably someone's cousin's face. Minstrels play, dancers whirl, and one particularly confident man attempts to ride a pig like a noble steed. It goes badly, but don't be fooled. All this excess has a purpose. It's meant to broadcast power, wealth, fertility, the ability to throw a party so grand that no one dares invade your land for fear of being served as the main course. These weddings are diplomatic handshakes disguised as flirtation. You don't just marry the person, you marry their political baggage, their alliances, their enemies, and sometimes their deeply dramatic family curse. Historically, these marriages were game changers. Alliances shifted, wars paused or exploded, territories were absorbed like water into bread. The union of two houses could make or break an entire region. Take, for example, the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Louis VII, then later to Henry II. Two royal weddings, one woman, and half of France changing hands like someone redealing a very bloody card game. And yet, despite the pomp and politics, there were rare moments of affection. Some noble couples did fall in love, eventually. There are letters, hesitant poems, gifts passed under heavy scrutiny. It wasn't common, but it wasn't impossible. Even in a marriage designed like a chess move, people still found ways to look at each other and say, well, you're not terrible. As the feast continues, you find yourself back near the edge of the crowd, your spouse beside you. You both chew on bits of roasted something, watching the dancers spin. Neither of you says much. There's no need. You're both thinking the same thing. Thank God our wedding was small. Because while the wine here flows freely and the music is grand, there's a strange tightness behind all the silk and smiling. The bride hasn't touched her food. The groom is whispering to a knight in a way that suggests someone's already plotting a betrayal. The performance is beautiful, but heavy. You and your spouse share a look. Yours may not have had sugar towers or bishops, but it was yours. Honest, quiet, muddy, sure, and goat-adjacent, but real. And in a world where weddings can move armies and ruin lives, that's worth more than all the roasted swan in Christendom. The noble entourage clears out the next day, leaving behind an overturned cart of empty barrels, a few trampled cabbages, and one extremely confused duck. The village exhales. You, your spouse, and just about everyone else retreat into something that feels dangerously close to relief. The main square no longer smells like truffle butter and horse sweat. The musicians are gone. The leftover meat is being picked over by dogs. You're back to normal life, or as close as it gets in a world that never lets you forget how temporary normal really is. And now, with the spectacle over, it's time to talk about the heart of medieval weddings. The ones that didn't involve velvet gowns, bishops, or 12-course feasts. The ones that took place in the dirt. The ones that were loud, chaotic, underfunded, and bursting with soul. In other words, peasant weddings. If the noble weddings were grand chess matches played on silken boards, peasant weddings were more like a good game of dice in a tavern. Messy, loud, unpredictable, and usually involving someone falling into a barrel. And you know what? That's not a bad thing. Your own wedding, in hindsight, fits squarely into this category. Simple food, community involvement, a priest who may or may not have been sober, a feast built on goodwill, borrowed benches, and someone's extremely enthusiastic uncle. And while you didn't have sculpted swans or a ring made of gold, you had something else. Participation. Everyone who came had a job, a dish to bring, a song to sing, a prayer to mumble through gritted teeth while laughing over spilled cider. That's how peasant weddings worked. It was a community event, not just a couple joining together, but families, neighbours, friends. Entire hamlets stitching themselves tighter around a shared celebration. Think of it as the village's excuse to drop the ploughs, put down the spinning wheels and dance until their knees gave out. Music was often the heart of it, even if the instruments were battered and the only tune everyone knew was that one lute song you can't get out of your head. Someone always had a drum, even if it was just a pot. Someone could play a pipe, or at least attempt to. And everyone danced. Even the elders. Maybe especially the elders, who knew all the verses to the dirty versions of the songs and were more than happy to teach the children when no one was looking. You remember the dancing at your own wedding, the way your feet stuck to the ground just a little because someone had spilled something sticky near the fire, the smell of sweat, yeast and old hay, the circle forming, breaking, reforming, that moment when you accidentally swung a neighbour into the cake table and no one even stopped playing. That was the rhythm of a peasant wedding. Imperfect, chaotic, absolutely alive. Food, too, had a certain rustic glory. No peacocks, no sugar towers, but stews thick with turnips, pies dense with mystery meats, bread so crusty it could double as armour. Every household brought what they could spare. Some weddings had no meat at all, just bread, ale and whatever the local herbs could flavour. And no one complained, because the point wasn't excess. It was togetherness. Quirky fact. In some villages, couples were given a wedding cheese, a large hard wheel that aged with their marriage. Every anniversary they'd carve a small piece, and by the time it turned to dust or started its own civilization of the mould, the couple was either celebrating 20 years or arguing about who forgot to lock the chicken coop. Symbolic, strange, and honestly kind of beautiful. But peasant weddings weren't just jolly messes. They also came with their own serious customs. The hand fasting, for instance. A tradition where the couple's hands were literally tied together with ribbon, cloth or cord during the ceremony. It wasn't just symbolic. In some regions, it was the actual marriage. No priest required. 2 hands, 1 vow, 1 knot. If the couple untied themselves at any point after the feast, well, that was between them and God. There's an ongoing debate among scholars about hand fasting. Was it always premarital? Was it a trial period, like medieval dating with paperwork? Or was it just a regional way of declaring marriage, especially in areas with limited access to clergy? The sources are murky, but the custom lasted for centuries, and in some places echoes of it still appear in weddings today. Those ribbon-tying ceremonies you see in modern rustic weddings. That's your great-great-great-great-grandmother's influence showing up with Pinterest energy. Back in your world, the days after the wedding blur into work. You wake, you eat, you till, you mend. You and your spouse fall into a rhythm that's not romantic exactly, but intimate in its own way. Passing each other tools, sharing bites of lunch, squabbling over who forgot to cover the grain sacks. Marriage, for peasants, was a partnership built on labour. You needed each other. To survive, to feed yourselves, to get through winter without dying of boredom, starvation or plague. There's no gilded bed, no silk sheets, just a straw mattress and the knowledge that if one of you doesn't wake early enough to feed the animals, you both go hungry. That's not love exactly, but it can be the beginning of it. And when the next village wedding rolls around, because there's always another, you and your spouse go together. You bring bread, you clap along, you dance, this time with slightly more coordination, and you watch the new couple begin their own story with nerves, sweat and hope, wrapped in rough-spun wool. There's no spotlight, no court poet immortalising their union, but there's laughter, a shared mug of ale, a new husband missing a shoe, a bride elbowing her way to the stew pot like she was born for this. And just like that, the dance starts again. It starts with a whisper. Just a few words overheard at the well, 2 women leaning close, one cupping her hand like the truth might spill if not properly contained. You're there for water, not gossip, but this is a medieval village. If you've got ears, you've got intel. And today's whisper is especially juicy. Someone's husband has a lover, not just a drunken night behind the stable, a real affair, ongoing, frequent, practically romantic if it weren't so scandalous. You nod politely and keep drawing your bucket, but now your brain's off to the races. This isn't the first time you've heard a story like this, probably won't be the last, and it brings you to a hard truth that even the most fragrant church incense can't mask. Medieval marriage didn't always mean monogamy. Sure, the church preached it. 1 man, 1 woman, bound for life, Fidelity, loyalty, the whole holy checklist. Adultery was a sin, punishable by penance, or in some places by public humiliation. Priests warned that unfaithful spouses would burn for eternity, or come back in the next life as a frog. But let's be real, rules are one thing, human nature is another. And in medieval Europe, people bent the rules with the creativity of someone trying to cook a feast with a single potato and a mouldy onion. Among nobles, affairs were practically a side quest. Everyone knew about them. Everyone pretended not to. Kings kept mistresses. Queens occasionally kept lovers. Court romances were whispered about in ballads, sometimes even celebrated if they were discreet enough. Eleanor of Aquitaine, whispers. Henry II, more than whispers. There were scandals involving knights, ladies-in-waiting, poets, even monks who forgot their vows during long winter nights. But here's where it gets weird. Infidelity wasn't just a noble hobby. It happened everywhere. In villages, on farms, between bakers and shepherds, and that guy who always smells like pickled onions. It didn't have to be romantic. Sometimes it was survival. A young widow takes up with a married merchant because he brings flour and firewood. A field hand sneaks off with a neighbour's wife because his own hasn't spoken to him since the last harvest. Is it love? Is it loneliness? Is it boredom? Usually it's a mess. You return home with your bucket, trying not to stare too long at your neighbour's doorway. That's where the affair supposedly is. It looks so normal. A broom leaning against the wall, a cat sunning itself. But now you see it differently. Like the whole house is hiding something behind the shutters. You and your spouse share bread and stew in silence. You don't bring up what you heard, neither do they. But you both know. These stories spread faster than fire in a thatched roof. And even though your marriage is still new, still half-shaped, still learning how to breathe, it's impossible not to feel the tremor. Like watching someone else's boat capsize while yours rocks gently on the same river. Now, technically, adultery was a legal offence in many regions. In ecclesiastical courts, wives caught cheating could be whipped, fined, or forced to do public penance, barefoot, in a shift, carrying a candle, weeping before the altar. Men? They were punished too, sometimes. If the husband of the woman they seduced was powerful or loud enough. Otherwise, a wink, a shrug, maybe a fine, but rarely ruin. That's the double standard. A man's affair was a mistake, a woman's, a betrayal, and not just of her husband, of her lineage. Her children could be called into question. Inheritance laws went into meltdown. A noble family could lose land, power, legitimacy, all because someone's eye wandered and someone else got pregnant. So people got sneaky. They met in barns, behind churches, in forests dense enough to swallow sound. They used symbols, flowers, ribbons, carved initials in wooden spoons. There are love letters, still surviving, full of desperation and poetry and truly terrible metaphors. One French knight wrote that his lover's eyes were two lanterns guiding him home, which is sweet, until you remember he was already married, and the home was not his actual house. Still, despite all the risk, people kept doing it. Why? Maybe because marriage wasn't always about choice. You didn't pick your spouse, you inherited them. And in many cases, affection came slowly, if at all. So people found companionship elsewhere. Not honourable, maybe, but understandable. Quirky fact. In parts of medieval Spain and southern France, there existed a cultural tradition called courtly love. Finema. It wasn't about marriage. In fact, it deliberately excluded it. It was about longing, admiration, a chaste, idealised love between a knight and a lady he could never truly have. The troubadours sang about it. They wrote poems where love was a sickness, and the cure was either death or a single glance from the beloved. It sounds dramatic, and it was, but it created an entire romantic code outside the structure of marriage. And here's the scholarly debate. Did courtly love affect real marriages, or was it just poetic fantasy? Some say it gave people an emotional outlet, an imaginary lover to pine for while stirring stew. Others argue it encouraged infidelity, planting seeds of desire that grew into action. Either way, it proved that the emotional lives of medieval people were complex. Marriage might have been a contract, but feelings didn't always obey contracts. You lie awake that night, staring at the thatched ceiling. Your spouse breathes steadily beside you. Nothing dramatic has happened. No betrayals. No strange glances. but the stories still linger. They get into your thoughts, like smoke into cloth, and you wonder what keeps a marriage steady, what keeps two people loyal in a world full of temptation, opportunity, and more goats than privacy. Maybe it's fear, maybe it's love, maybe it's knowing that at the end of the day, your spouse is the one who'll help you dig out the latrine trench when the floods come. Not glamorous, but very hard to cheat on someone while knee-deep in mud and shared misery. Tomorrow, someone else will whisper something new. A baker who flirts too much. A woman who's been seen sneaking out of the tavern after dark. Life moves on, and your marriage, it keeps moving too. One step at a time, one shared chore, one quiet meal, one chance, every day, not to be the next scandal sung about at the well. The rain hits like a sermon, loud, long, and impossible to ignore. You and your spouse are stuck inside, huddled around the hearth with a half-rotted log that smokes more than it burns. The stew is thin, the bread's gone stale. There's a draft coming from somewhere you can't locate. In short, it's the perfect day to start opening wedding gifts. Not that you're expecting anything glamorous. This isn't a velvet-cushioned gift registry situation. You're not unwrapping engraved spoons or monogrammed bedding. In the medieval world, wedding gifts are practical, symbolic, occasionally terrifying. The first bundle is from your aunt, the one with the missing teeth and suspicious ability to track family gossip with military precision. It's a set of linens, coarse, beige, and already mended in 2 places. To start your household, she'd said, as if you hadn't already slept on those very sheets during childhood. Still, you fold them carefully. Reusing a wedding gift that's technically older than your marriage. Absolutely on brand. Next is a carved wooden cup from a neighbour you don't really like but can't avoid because he owns the only grindstone in town. There's a knot in the base where it leaks slightly, but it's still valuable. Cup equals function. Drinking vessel equals status. You accept it with a tight smile and a plan to seal the hole with pitch and pretend it works fine. A jar of salted fish, a bundle of dried herbs, a cloak with someone else's initials already embroidered in the hem. These are the gifts of your people. Not sentimental, not personalised, but given with intent. Each item says, "We want you to survive." In a way, that's the best blessing you can get. Then comes the box. Small, wooden, clearly ancient. You recognise it instantly. It belonged to your grandmother. It smells like cloves and thyme. Inside is a silver pin in the shape of a bird, worn smooth with age. Your mother gave it to you with no explanation. Your great-grandmother wore this on her wedding day, she'd said, and her mother before her. It's yours now. This is no ordinary accessory. This is a wedding heirloom, a relic passed through the generations, heavy with meaning. You don't know all its stories, but you know it's seen more wedding nights than your parish priest, and probably handled them better. You pin it to your cloak, feeling the chill of the metal, the weight of the women who wore it before you. You wonder what they'd say about your marriage. Probably something short, dry, and accompanied by a sharp elbow. Wedding gifts in medieval Europe weren't just about generosity. They were about continuity, survival, symbolism. A copper pot might keep you fed. A wooden comb might prevent lice. A carved spoon might be the only utensil you ever owned that wasn't snapped in half by a neighbour's toddler. And the heirlooms? They were tokens of lineage, of family, of bloodlines that insisted on persisting, no matter how many plagues and famines tried to erase them. But not all gifts were practical. Some were pure symbolism, pieces of lore wrapped in cloth, a twig of rowan to ward off evil spirits, a handful of salt to ensure prosperity, a goose feather tucked under your mattress to promote fertility. You actually find one of those while shaking out the bedding. You hold it up to your spouse, who blinks and says, "Is that from your side or mine?" You shrug. Probably both. There's a quirky tradition from medieval Wales where couples were given a knife. Yes, a knife, as a wedding gift. Not to cut food, but to settle disputes. If a couple argued, they were supposed to place the knife between them and reflect on the severity of their disagreement. The idea being, do I love this person enough not to stab them right now? Surprisingly effective. Probably why so many knives were dull from overuse. You also get a hunk of beeswax in the shape of a lamb. For peace in your home, the note says, written in shaky ink. You're not sure whether to light it, eat it, or worship it, so you place it on the mantle and bow to it once, just in case. Scholars still argue over how widespread symbolic gifting was in peasant communities. Some say it was localized. Certain villages passed down specific items like fertility charms or tokens of protection. Others believe it was mostly practical, with emotional weight added later through oral tradition. There's very little written record of how these gifts were given or used, but the fact that so many of them appear in folk songs and family stories suggests they meant something. Maybe even more than a fat dowry or a bishop's blessing. Speaking of dowries, not every gift comes from outside the marriage. Some are given within it, from one spouse to the other. A lock of hair, a prayer written in secret, a token shared in the dark. These are the quiet gifts, the ones no one sees. You haven't exchanged anything like that yet, not formally. But when your spouse pulls a bundle from behind the hearth and hands it to you without ceremony, your heart kicks just a little. Inside is a spindle, hand-carved, smooth, familiar. Yours broke last week, and you hadn't said a word. This one's shaped almost exactly like your old one, but lighter, balanced. You look at them, surprised. They just shrug. You needed it. It's nothing. It's everything. In the end, medieval wedding gifts are less about the object and more about the gesture. You don't get gold or titles. You get thread. You get salted meat. You get a pin shaped like a bird that whispers stories into your cloak when the wind blows. These are gifts that matter because they say, "We've done this before. You're not alone. We want you to make it." The rain keeps falling. You stack the gifts in the corner, neatly, carefully. You press the pin into place. You light the fire under the stew pot, using twigs someone tucked into your basket with a smile and no explanation. You sit beside your spouse, sharing silence and steam, and you think, this is what marriage feels like in real time. Unearned, unfolding, unexpectedly precious. One feather, one pot, one patched cloak at a time. The messenger arrived just before dawn, mud-caked boots, half a beard, and an expression that told you he'd seen more than his share of dying. His voice cracked as he spoke to the priest, too low for you to hear clearly. But by the time the bell rang, everyone knew. Old Gerrit was on his deathbed. His wife of 40 years had already lit the last candle, and now he was calling for a priest and a bride. You pause at the doorway to the church, stunned. A bride, you ask your spouse. They nod grimly. He's marrying Marjorie, today, before he goes. You knew about Marjorie. Everyone did. She'd been with him for years. His housekeeper, his companion, his comfort after his first wife died. But they'd never married. At least not officially. No banns, no vows, no priestly blessing. Just shared bread, quiet dinners, and a seat saved for her at every feast. And now, with Gerrit's lungs full of fluid and a ghost already leaning in close, they were tying the knot. At the edge of life, in full view of eternity. You've heard of this before. Deathbed marriages. A frantic sprint towards sanctity, forgiveness, and spiritual paperwork. They happened more often than you'd think. A man facing the final breath decides to make things right. A woman with nothing to inherit agrees because even a little security is better than none. Sometimes it's love, sometimes it's strategy, sometimes it's fear. Inside the small chapel, the light is watery and grey. The priest stands beside the makeshift bed, muttering the rites with extra urgency. Marjorie kneels by Gerrit's side, eyes red, hands folded so tightly her knuckles shine. She's not young, but there's something youthful in the tremor of her breath, like the ceremony has cracked open a part of her that she locked away decades ago. The priest's voice wavers, "Wilt thou take this, man?" And Marjorie whispers, "I will," so quietly you almost miss it. Gerrit manages to nod. Once. A slow, deliberate motion that feels final. The room is still. Even the usual creaks of the old beams seem to pause in reverence. And then, with a faint sigh, it's over. The marriage is complete. And minutes later, so is Gerrit's life. You step back into the cold air, goosebumps rising. You don't know whether to feel honoured or hollow. You just witnessed a wedding and a funeral in the span of a prayer. Marjorie doesn't cry. She stands quietly while the priest closes Gerrit's eyes and covers him with a sheet. For a moment she looks lighter, then heavier. This kind of union wasn't typical, but it wasn't rare either. In a world where disease could strike fast and medicine was mostly herbs and guesses, The deathbed was often the last place people could try to right a life's worth of wrongs. The church generally allowed these marriages, especially if the dying person was still conscious and consented. It was even encouraged in some cases. Better to marry than die in sin. Better to leave behind a legitimate widow than a partner condemned to gossip and legal uncertainty. But there were complications. Property, for one. A deathbed marriage could suddenly entitle a new spouse to land, livestock, or even a family heirloom someone else had their eye on. You've seen it happen. A son shows up late to the burial, demanding to know why his inheritance now belongs to that woman who cleaned the floor and never wore shoes indoors. The priest shrugs. The paperwork is sacred. The vows were witnessed. End of story. There are records of deathbed marriages stirring full-blown legal battles. Was the bride coerced? Was the groom too weak to consent? Did someone forge a signature on the dowry record? You could lose everything if someone in the village could prove the wedding wasn't valid. And if you had enemies, as most people did, someone would try. But for people like Marjorie, it wasn't about land or cows. It was about legitimacy, dignity, a way to be named, remembered, and mourned properly. Without a marriage, she wouldn't have the right to stand at his grave. She wouldn't be called his widow. She'd be the woman he kept, a ghost in someone else's family history. There's a quirky tradition in parts of Italy where deathbed marriages had a second step, public confirmation. After the dying person passed, the priest would announce the marriage aloud in the town square, often during the funeral procession. That way, everyone knew. No arguments, no confusion. You were married, even if the honeymoon was 15 minutes and half of it involved coughing up blood. And here's where scholars argue. Were these marriages about faith or desperation? Some say they were deeply sincere, final acts of love and reconciliation. Others believe they were legal maneuvers, ways to gain favour with the church or secure property rights. The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in between. People are messy, even when dying. You think of your own marriage, still new, still full of chores and fumbling affection. You think of what you'd say if the end came suddenly. Would you feel like you did enough, said enough, loved enough? Would your spouse know? That night, the bells toll low and slow. Marjorie sits by the fire in her small home, dressed in grey, silent. The village is quiet, unsure of how to treat her. Widow or not, respect or suspicion. You decide for yourself and bring her a bowl of stew. You don't say much, just hand it over, wait for her nod, and leave. Because here's the thing about medieval marriage. It doesn't always happen where it's supposed to. Not always in churches, not always with music. Sometimes it happens in whispers, in desperation, in beds lined with straw and regret. And sometimes those marriages matter more than the grandest vows said under vaulted ceilings and stained glass. You lie beside your spouse that night, their hand warm against yours under the blanket. You say nothing, but your thumb brushes theirs once, twice, and maybe that's enough, just in case. You're elbow deep in soap suds trying to scrub dried lentils off a wooden bowl when a teenager barrels into the courtyard shouting, "She's gone! She ran!" At first you think it's just someone who dropped a goat or lost track of their laundry again. But then you see the mother, pale, breathless, furious, storming down the path with her skirt hiked and her apron flapping like a battle flag. "I told her," she yells. "I told her she'd regret this!" Behind her trails the girl's father, red-faced and sweating, with a handful of crumpled wedding garlands. It's official. The bride has bolted. You drop the bowl, wipe your hands, and step outside. The whole village is gathering like ants to spilled honey. Everyone's whispering, not quietly, not even respectfully. This is better than last year's cow escape and the week the priest fell asleep during the baptism combined. The girl, Annalise, was supposed to marry today. You'd seen her yesterday, tight-lipped, hands shaking, braiding her hair with rosemary. You knew the look, not excitement, resignation. Her groom was older, sharp-faced, always smelled vaguely like onions left too long in the sun. A good match on paper. Two families with grain to trade and adjoining land. But clearly Annalise preferred a different sort of freedom. Runaway brides weren't as rare as you might think. In fact, they were a recurring feature in the messy landscape of medieval marriage. Some disappeared before the vows, some waited until the wedding night. A few even vanished weeks later, taking a chicken, a pair of boots, and a whole bundle of chaos with them. And when they did, it ignited legal, social, and spiritual fires that burned longer than the marriages themselves ever would have lasted. The first response to a runaway bride was panic, then fury, then damage control. Parents had to scramble to avoid the shame. The would-be groom's family demanded compensation. The priest muttered something about sin and scandal while flipping through canon law trying to remember if fleeing was grounds for excommunication or just a strongly worded sermon. But the biggest issue? The dowry. If one had been exchanged, or even promised, everyone started arguing about who owed what. Did the groom keep the gifts? Did the bride's family get them back? Did the girl's absence void the whole contract? Or did the priest get to claim someone was married just because the paperwork had been blessed in advance? It gets complicated quickly. In some places, betrothal alone was nearly as binding as a marriage. Breaking it could result in fines, property losses, or public penance. A girl might be hauled before a local magistrate or dragged back home under armed supervision. And if she'd already been known carnally by her betrothed, that changed everything. The church was obsessed with ensuring that unions were properly ordered, and a broken engagement post-consummation could bring the whole wrath of the ecclesiastical courts. Of course, things didn't always go that far. Sometimes, if the runaway bride came from a powerful enough family or if she had enough allies, people just let it go, whispered, judged, but let it go. Some girls even used running away as a bargaining tool. One noblewoman from the 13th century France fled to a convent to avoid her marriage, knowing her father would be forced to negotiate a better match just to get her back. Bold? Absolutely. Risky? Beyond words, but sometimes the only way out was out. You ask someone if anyone's seen where Anneliese went. She had a horse waiting, someone says, left just before sunrise. Another claims she's riding for her cousin's farm. A third swears she's meeting a lover in the next town. It could all be true, or none of it. Right now, the truth is wrapped in speculation and the cloud of dust she left behind. You glance at your spouse, who's watching all this unfold with unreadable eyes. After a moment, they murmur, "Good for her." It surprises you, then it doesn't. You both know what it means to live a life shaped by other people's decisions. You were lucky. Your match turned out survivable, maybe even promising. But not everyone has that luck. Some get cornered, pressured, married off like sheep for sale, with less say in the matter than the animals tied to the fence. There's a quirky case from medieval Germany where a bride escaped during the wedding feast, slid under the table, ran through the kitchen, and stole a baker's cloak on the way out. She hid in a monastery for 3 days before finally being granted sanctuary. The marriage was called off. The groom was furious. The baker was livid about his cloak. But the church ruled that forced consent wasn't valid consent. It was one of the earliest recorded decisions that upheld a woman's right to say no, even after the cake had been cut. Of course, not all runaways were brides. Grooms ran too. Less often, but with equal dramatic flair. There's an English record of a man who fled into the woods the morning of his wedding and returned 3 weeks later with a bear bite, claiming divine inspiration told him to remain single. His bride married his cousin instead. It was that or waste the garlands. You walk back home through the chatter, the clucking of scandal-warmed hens, the priest already muttering a sermon to himself about feminine frailty and obedience. You resist the urge to roll your eyes. Because here's the reality. Medieval marriage, for all its rules, was still negotiated one human at a time. Some followed the path laid out for them, some stumbled into it, and some, like Anneliese, bolted for the hills and hoped for the best. Back at home, your spouse hands you a cup of Waterdale. You drink in silence, both of you still thinking about her. You wonder if she made it out safely, if someone helped her, if she left a note, or if she simply couldn't imagine another day waking up in a bed she never chose, beside a man she never loved. You stare into the hearth and imagine the road ahead of her. Muddy, narrow, uncertain. But hers. And you think, maybe that's what marriage should be in the end. A choice, not a trap, not a sentence. A step forward that feels like freedom, not a door slamming shut behind you. The road to the next village is long, rutted, and smells faintly like sheep dung and summer dust. But you walk it anyway, your spouse by your side, the two of you carrying bundles of cheese, dried herbs, and one surprisingly intact clay jug of ale. There's a wedding ahead, one that's taken months to plan, and you've been invited as honoured guests, mostly because the groom is your cousin, and partly because you're the only people in his family who haven't threatened to strangle someone during planning. As you approach the village, you hear music already drifting through the air, pipes, drums, and a slightly off-key fiddle that suggests someone's enthusiasm may be stronger than their tuning. A crowd has gathered in front of a half-finished barn where benches made of logs and planks have been set in a rough circle. The groom, a lanky youth with dirt permanently crusted under his nails, is grinning, like a man who's either blissfully in love or completely unaware of how marriage actually works. And there, under a garland of ivy and wheat stalks, stands the bride. She's radiant, not in the golden light of heaven sort of way, but in the grounded, flushed cheek, I've been baking all night and still look presentable kind of way. Her dress is clean, at least in the front. Her sleeves are adorned with red stitching, protective runes perhaps, or just the fancy work of a grandmother with strong opinions. She clutches a small pouch tied with red ribbon, probably full of herbs or coins or some other charm against the terrifying uncertainty of forever. This is what you've come for. Not just the ceremony, but the ritual, the symbols, the superstition, the communal choreography that transforms two people standing awkwardly beside each other into a married pair with shared responsibility and, if they're lucky, shared affection. The priest arrives late, looking as though he's had to chase down a donkey mid-sermon. He's winded, out of sorts, but clearly determined to make this union count. He wipes his brow, opens his book, and begins in Latin, switching halfway through to the local tongue once he realises half the guests are more interested in the wine cask than eternal salvation. As he speaks, the crowd watches, murmurs, hums along. This is all deeply familiar. You've seen it before, not just in your own wedding, but in a dozen others. The hand-fasting cord, dyed green and gold, is wrapped slowly around their joined hands. The blessing of the bread, a small round loaf split in two, follows next. Each of them eats a piece, then feeds a bit to the other, the symbolic first act of mutual care. The tradition is as old as anyone can remember. Some say it predates Christianity altogether. Grain for life, bread for unity, yeast for, well, hopefully not awkward metaphors. A rooster crows at the wrong moment. A child lets out a triumphant shriek after catching a frog mid-leap. And still, the priest continues, determined. He blesses the marriage, sprinkles a few drops of water from a small wooden cup, and finally steps back. And then, it's done. The couple is married. The knot is tied. The witnesses cheer. Someone lights a torch that was supposed to wait until evening. You think the fiddler may be crying. The couple kisses, briefly, politely. The crowd pretends not to laugh. This isn't just a celebration, it's a map. Every gesture, every object, every chant and charm is a marker for the path ahead. There's the salt bowl placed at the head table. Salt to ward off evil, salt to preserve the bond, salt because it's expensive and therefore fancy. There's the broom, laid across the threshold of their new home. They'll step over it later, holding hands, the final move before crossing into married life. A symbolic sweep, clearing away whatever lingers from their single pasts. You see the bride's mother tuck a coin into her daughter's shoe. One coin for luck, one for future children. If it falls out before nightfall, tradition says the marriage will be bumpy. If it stays in, at least they'll have luck enough to get through winter. Quirky fact. In parts of rural Ireland and Scotland, couples were sometimes married over a sword. Not metaphorically, literally. They'd place the blade between them during vows, tip toward the earth, to symbolise honesty and the cutting of old ties. If the blade rusted later, it was taken as a sign of deceit, which makes you think, maybe you should go check on that knife from your own ceremony, just in case. The newlyweds are swept up in celebration. You're pulled into dances you only half remember, laughing as someone nearly knocks over a table while spinning the wrong direction. The food comes out, stews, pies, beans in garlicky sauce. You're seated near the fire with your spouse, who casually steals the last turnip from your plate. You raise an eyebrow, they grin. This is your new ritual. Later in the evening, the bride is led into a side room. Not for anything dramatic, just the bedding blessing, a slightly uncomfortable but ancient tradition. A few women gather to tuck her into the couple's bed with symbolic gestures, laying a sprig of rosemary under the pillow, sprinkling dried lavender for peace, and, depending on local tradition, placing a wooden spoon beneath the mattress to stir the womb. No one talks about it much, but everyone knows why it's done. Scholars still debate how widespread or necessary these fertility-focused rituals were. Some argue they were more theatrical than serious. Others say they were essential, especially in a world where a childless marriage could unravel everything. These rituals offered comfort, assurance, a sense of control in an otherwise precarious world. Eventually the groom joins her. The door is closed, and though you hear nothing, thank the saints, someone outside cheerfully ties the latch with a ribbon, another tradition meant to bind the night together. You and the others give a final cheer and drift off into the dark, full of wine and the warmth of collective joy. On the walk back to your lodging, you and your spouse talk quietly, not about the ceremony, not about the food, but about the way everything, every single part had meaning. How nothing was just a decoration, how each ritual, no matter how strange, held a little pocket of belief. You wonder aloud what people will remember of your wedding, what symbols you left behind. Your spouse shrugs. Hopefully not the goat that stole the bread loaf, you laugh, tired and happy. Because symbols may come and go, but the memory of shared laughter in the middle of a field, with stew on your sleeve and someone else's baby drooling on your boot, that sticks. This is how you marry in the Middle Ages, not just with vows, but with symbols that speak louder than words ever could. It's morning again, and for once the chickens are quiet. Maybe even they understand what kind of day it is. The sky's overcast, not stormy but heavy, like it's holding something back. You and your spouse are out early, helping clear a field for harvest, when someone jogs down the path with a face full of urgency and shoes full of mud. To the church, they huff, barely pausing. You're wanted. You exchange a glance, drop your tools and follow. Turns out there's trouble. Not fire and pitchfork trouble, legal trouble, and that's worse in some ways because instead of adrenaline, you get paperwork and angry parents quoting scripture. At the centre of it all is a young couple, Elric and Tilda, barely out of adolescence, sitting awkwardly on a bench while three elders argue across the room. The issue? They say they're married. No priest, no witnesses, no feast. Just a promise made at twilight behind the mill, a few quiet words, and the world spinning differently ever since. You sigh. Because this right here is the nightmare scenario, a clandestine marriage. Two people swearing themselves to each other in secret, then emerging with tearful eyes, and a claim no one wants to deal with. And the worst part, it might be valid. For centuries in medieval Europe, the Church's rules on marriage were clear in theory. Public vows, proper witnesses, bans announced 3 times, and a priest to bless it all. But in practice, if two people were of age and gave mutual consent, especially using present tense vows like, "I take you as my wife," their marriage could be considered binding. Even without anyone else present, this wasn't a loophole, it was a doctrinal cornerstone. The sacrament of marriage, according to church teaching, rested on consent. That was the glue, not the rings, not the bread, not even the priest. So now Elric and Tilda sit nervously, while half the village argues about whether they've just ruined their lives or officially begun them. You listen as the priest reads from a dog-eared canon law book, brow furrowed so deeply he looks like he's lost in a maze. The bride's father wants the marriage annulled, claims she was coerced. The groom's mother insists it was mutual. The priest looks like he wants to fake a plague outbreak just to escape the conversation. This isn't rare. In fact, clandestine marriages became such a widespread problem, especially among the younger and more impulsive, that church councils repeatedly tried to crack down on them. By the 12th and 13th centuries, new rules were introduced. Mandatory witnesses, bans published in advance, and penalties for secret unions. But still, people found ways, behind barns, in forests, on the edge of town under the stars, because sometimes love, or stubbornness, moves faster than bureaucracy. There's even a quirky case from 14th century England involving 2 teenagers who eloped using a Latin phrase they barely understood. Something like "sponte mi maxipio," which loosely translates to "I take you of my own will." When they were caught, the boy claimed he thought it meant "I like your hair." The marriage stood. Latin hair compliments apparently are binding. You sit down beside the couple and ask gently what happened. Tilda stares at the floor. Elric clears his throat. "We didn't plan it," he says. "It just felt right. We talked about it, and then we said the words." You nod. Did anyone hear you? No. He looks embarrassed. Just the goats. Not ideal. The priest finally leans forward, fingers steepled. What did you say? Exactly. Elric and Tilda recite it together, voices shaking. I take you as my wife. I take you as my husband. For as long as we both live. The priest closes his eyes, sighs like a man who's just lost at dice. Well, that'll do it. Because technically, that's it. That's all that's needed. But now comes the fallout. The girl's family is still fuming. The boy's family wants recognition. And the church has to decide whether to formalize the marriage or press for annulment. These decisions could take weeks, sometimes months. They might be called before a bishop. Someone might demand penance, or compensation, or both. And the entire time the couple lives in limbo, both married and not, guilty and blessed, depending on which part of the room you stand in. This is why clandestine marriages were so dangerous, not because they were always wrong, but because they were always uncertain. They lacked protection, lacked structure, lacked the social scaffolding that helped marriages endure. You could love each other deeply, but without recognition, you had nothing to fall back on. And scholars today still debate whether these unions were acts of love, rebellion, or desperation. Some argue that young people use secret vows to dodge parental interference or social pressure. Others think they were emotional outbursts, more romantic gesture than commitment. But in either case, the consequences could be enormous. Because if the church recognized the union, it was indissoluble. No undo button, no annulment unless fraud or coercion could be proven. And if one party changed their mind later, too bad. You said the words, you're in it now. Eventually the priest calls for a break. The family storm out to stew in their respective corners. You stay behind, watching Elric and Tilda whisper to each other, pinkies linked, shoulders brushing like magnets. You can't help it. You remember your own wedding. The nerves, the dry mouth. The moment you said the words and the room shifted. Whether surrounded by people or not, it's still a leap. A crossing. And sometimes, no matter how much structure you build around it, marriage still comes down to two people holding hands and hoping. That night, after everything's been tabled for tomorrow, you and your spouse walk home slowly. You talk about the couple, about love, about recklessness, and whether you'd have run off for each other given the chance. Probably, your spouse says, though I'd have brought a witness just in case. You laugh, but there's truth in it. Because love, while powerful, needs more than passion. It needs protection, context, a community to carry it when things get hard. And maybe, just maybe, a few goats as silent witnesses wouldn't hurt. You wake to the sound of singing, not the drunken kind that staggers through taverns late at night, or the sacred hum that echoes off chapel stone. This is different. Clear, rhythmic, and layered with that distinct note of practiced repetition. A women's chorus by the sound of it, rising like steam over morning bread. Curious, you follow it to the meadow near the old mill, where a group of girls and women are weaving long garlands of flowers, yarrow and wheat stalks into a thick rope that stretches more than 30 feet. You blink, and then it clicks. There's going to be a wedding procession. Not just any wedding, though. A May wedding. And in the medieval world, that means one thing above all. Seasonal symbolism dialed to 11. The month of May was considered the sacred sweet spot of fertility, abundance, and slightly better weather. It had all the mystique of new beginnings and just enough sunshine to keep the priest from grumbling about muddy roads. For many couples, marrying in May was both practical and powerful. Crops were in the ground, livestock had stopped dropping dead from winter, and people were just warm and bored enough to really commit to an outdoor celebration. And as you settle in at the edge of the field, you quickly realise this one is shaping up to be part religious rite, part pagan throwback, and part local theatre with more flowers than necessary. The bride is a second daughter from a family known more for dairy than drama. She walks barefoot, dressed in a linen shift dyed faint green, with a crown of primrose and daisy petals clinging to her hair. The groom, a nervous butcher's apprentice, carries a sprig of hawthorn in his belt and looks like he's rehearsed how not to faint at least twice. They're led by children throwing handfuls of petals and grain, which the chickens behind them immediately begin to eat. It's chaotic, joyful, ridiculous, but woven through it all is meaning. In many medieval communities, weddings tied to seasonal festivals weren't just for show, they were spiritually loaded. May in particular brought with it echoes of Beltane, an ancient Celtic festival of fire, fertility and boundary crossing. Even in the Christian Middle Ages, those old rhythms pulsed beneath the surface. People might chant prayers in Latin by day and leap bonfires by night. Today's wedding isn't overtly pagan, of course. The priest is very present, holding his book like a sword warding off heresy. But even he can't stop the traditions. The bedding bough, a leafy branch hung over the couple's doorway, is already in place. The cows have ribbons on their horns. Someone's decorated the well with garlands, and you spot at least 3 women whispering over a candle, melting wax into water to see the couple's future. Definitely not in the Book of Matthew. You watch as the wedding party arrives at a wooden arch built from birch poles and twine. Here the couple pauses for the rite of crossing, a tradition in parts of northern Europe where the bride and groom step over a threshold of herbs, symbolic of leaving their old lives and entering a new shared fate. You remember doing something similar, though your herb bed was mostly a muddy patch and some squashed leeks. Once beneath the arch, the priest begins the blessing. It's shorter than usual. He knows this is the prelude, not the main event. He invokes saints, protection, and a fruitful union. The crowd mumbles along. The couple exchange tokens. She gives him a ribbon dyed with elderberry juice. He gives her a small carved pendant that looks suspiciously like a pig. A symbol of prosperity, someone whispers beside you, or appetite, either way. Then comes the circle dance, a community affair meant to bind not just the couple, but everyone involved. Guests clasp hands and move in wide, clumsy loops while the newlyweds are led inside the circle, then out again, then back in. It's dizzying, symbolic of life, seasons, marriage, or maybe it's just a good excuse to fall on your face and laugh. Quirky fact. In parts of medieval Eastern Europe, May weddings were sealed with a ceremonial splash of water. Guests would douse the bride with a bucket or two at the end of the procession, symbolising purity, fertility, and probably mild pneumonia. Thankfully, today's couple avoids that particular tradition. The well's too far, and the priest already looks like he's considering an early retirement. There's a scholarly debate about how much these seasonal rituals were tolerated by the church versus merely tolerated by the people. Some clerics worked hard to suppress them, labelling anything remotely pre-Christian as dangerous superstition. Others, especially in rural areas, looked the other way. After all, if a bride wanted to wear foxglove for luck and jump a small fire before bedtime, who was going to stop her? Besides, most villagers couldn't read, but they could remember rituals passed down through 3 generations of grandmothers with iron wills and mystical gardens. You follow the procession as it snakes its way to the couple's new home, a small cottage newly thatched and still smelling of fresh reeds. There, the bride smears a bit of honey on the threshold and leads her husband over it. Inside, a clay bowl waits on the hearth, filled with milk, barley, and 3 silver buttons. A charm! You've seen it before. No one really remembers what it's for, but everyone agrees it works. That night, the feast blurs into a glow of firelight and wine. People sing May songs, half of them ribald, the other half just weird. Someone brings out a flute. Someone else dances with a chicken. The newlyweds are toasted until they can barely sit upright. You and your spouse share a blanket, warm ale, and a few quiet observations about how young they seem, how much they'll learn, how the rhythms of planting, feeding, surviving, loving, will shape them far more than any garland ever could. The bonfire is lit just after sundown, and the couple walks past it together, hand in hand, their shadows long and intertwined. No one says much, no one needs to. The symbolism does the talking. You head home under stars too bright to ignore. Your spouse squeezes your hand once, briefly, and in that moment it's clear. Marriage isn't just about the vows, it's about the seasons, the rituals, the community that wraps itself around you when your feet are uncertain and the path is dark. And maybe, if you're lucky, the occasional pig-shaped pendant to keep things interesting. You're standing in the church again, but this time you're not here for vows, a feast, or even scandal. You're here for the annual blessing of marriages, a quiet, often overlooked, part of the village calendar, but one that draws every married couple in from the hills, fields and cob cottages, even if only to nod through the priest's half-mumbled Latin and whisper under their breath about who's gained weight and whose goat still wanders. It's been a whole year since your own wedding. You didn't realise until you were polishing the cup from your wedding feast this morning, and your spouse said, "Hey, Remember when the bread caught fire and no one noticed for 20 minutes? You did. You laughed. And then you both went quiet, the way people do when they realise that time didn't just pass. It galloped. The blessing ceremony is more symbolic than sacred now, a way to refresh old vows, not with legal force but with social weight. It reminds everyone that marriage isn't a one-day performance. It's an ongoing ritual, quiet and strange, full of repetition and repair. And for better or worse, you're still in it. You look around the room, there's the baker and his wife, both kneeling with a toddler wriggling between them like a worm in church clothes. There's that elderly couple who never speak but are always side by side like two fence posts bound by ivy. And then there's Tilda and Elric. Yes, that Tilda and Elric, now fully recognised, her belly gently rounded beneath her apron, the scandal long since forgotten. Their hands are clasped. Firm, proud. The priest drones the blessing, his voice barely reaching the rafters. Something about St. Joseph and Mary, about fidelity, hardship and joy. You catch phrases, you miss others. But the cadence is familiar now, soothing even. You murmur responses with the rest, not really because you believe every word, but because it feels right to say them anyway. Afterward, the couples exit 2 by 2. Some look relieved, some look bored, a few look transformed. Most, though, just look tired in that particular way married people do, like they've been through something, made peace with it, and now just want to find the nearest bench and a slice of cheese. Outside, there's no feast, no dance, no goat stealing this time, just a slow drift of people toward home, arms linked or not, shoulders brushing, silence settling. You and your spouse walk in step, quiet, comfortable. You pass the field where your wedding garlands once hung, now bare and overgrown. The vines have crept up the fence post. A bird's built a nest in the corner. The wind rustles the tall grass, and for a moment, it feels like the land itself remembers. There's a strange comfort in the continuity of it all, in knowing that weddings come and go, some sacred, some scandalous, some utterly ridiculous. But marriage, the living part, keeps happening in between, in chores, in laughter, in silences too tired to explain. You've survived the goat-stealing cousin, the mouldy dowry cheese, the collapsing bench at your wedding feast. You've learned how to argue, how to forgive, how to share the last apple without pretending you weren't eyeing it for 3 days. And as the path bends toward home, you pass a couple standing by the edge of the road. Young, new, nervous. They're holding hands like they're not sure if it's allowed. You give them a nod and the woman asks, "Is the blessing over?" You tell them it is. She looks disappointed, but the man says, "We can go next year then." And you smile, because that's it, isn't it? Marriage isn't about showing up once and being done. It's about showing up again, and again, and again. Every morning, every evening, every laugh and fight and silent stew. Back home, you hang your cloak, pour 2 cups of weak ale, and sit by the hearth. Your spouse pulls out the spindle you gifted them on your wedding day, now worn smooth with use, and sets it beside the fire. No words, just a shared glance, a nod. That's the vow now. Less dramatic, more durable. You think back over everything. Noble weddings with their sugar castles and political stakes, peasants dancing in the dirt, clandestine ceremonies whispered in the dark, runaway brides and deathbed confessions, and all of it, in one way or another, circles back to this. 2 people trying to build something together, despite the chaos around them. That's the real heart of a medieval wedding. Not the gown, the garlands, the roast peacock. It's what comes after. The quiet, awkward, wonderful part no one sings songs about. You stretch your feet toward the fire, your spouse leans their head against your shoulder, and that's enough. So here you are, back where it all began, same thatched roof, same creaky bed frame, same oddly shaped spoon that somehow became your favourite. The fire crackles low, casting long lazy shadows across the floor. Outside, the village has quieted to its usual hum, a distant owl, the occasional dog snore, maybe someone still singing faintly from down the road. But in here it's calm. It's enough. You lie back, eyes half closed, the weight of the day and the whole year settling across your limbs like a wool blanket. It's strange, isn't it? How much weddings say with so little. A look, a knot, a piece of bread, the stories of nobility with their velvet and politics, the wild traditions of peasant joy, the secret vows whispered between trees, even the sudden moments of heartbreak, runaway brides, deathbed promises, each thread tied into the larger cloth of what it meant to marry in the medieval world. And maybe now you see it differently, not just as ceremony, but as survival, as faith, as choosing over and over to lean towards someone instead of away. There's a kind of quiet heroism in that. No one writes ballads about couples who share chores and eat the last turnip without resentment, but maybe they should. Your spouse shifts beside you, murmurs something unintelligible, then sighs back into sleep. You smile, you watch the glow of the fire flicker against the ceiling, and you think, this is the part of the wedding no one warns you about, the best part, the long, slow, ordinary miracle of it all. Now close your eyes, let the flickers fade, the vows have been said, the feast is done. The rest, my friend, is up to you.